Welcome to our story, Chapter 7. This chapter will cover New England from 1676 to 1714. The first quarter of this chapter will cover the history leading up to the Salem Witch Trials. It will include new colonial charters, slaves in New England, another revolution in England, and the French Indian Wars. After that, I'll introduce 16 of our ancestors who were caught up in the Salem Witch Trials. And I'll end the chapter by discussing 21 of our ancestors who were attacked and killed or kidnapped during the First and Second French Indian Wars. Okay, now comes the timeline. In 1676, King Philip's War that I discussed in the last chapter ended. In 1684, King Charles II revoked the Massachusetts-based corporate charter. 1685, King Charles dies and King James, his brother, becomes the king. In 1686, King James created the Dominion of New England. 1688, the Glorious Revolution begins in England. In 1688 also, King James is deposed and William and Mary become the King and Queen of England. In 1688, French Indian War begins. In 1691, Massachusetts becomes a royal colony. And in 1692, the Salem Witch Trials begin. In 1694, Groton is attacked during the King Philip War. In 1702, King William dies and King Anne becomes queen. In 1702, the Queen Anne War begins. And in 1707, Groton is attacked again during the Queen Anne War. Since the English kings and queens are a big part of our story, I thought that it might be helpful to begin with a quick tour of the English kings and queens that reigned in the 1600s and how they were related to each other. We've already talked about some of them, but I'll include the ones from 1600 to give a complete picture. England and American colonies were ruled by these people, and their decisions were a major impact on the lives of our ancestors. I'll start with King James I, who ruled from 1603 to 1625. He issued the charter for the Virginia Stock Company, which we talked about in Chapter 4. King Charles I was his son, who ruled from 1626 to 1649 and was executed during the English Civil War. Puritan dictator Oliver Cromwell ruled from 1650 to 1660. The monarchy was restored when King Charles I's son, Charles II, became king and ruled until his death in 1685. King Charles I's second son, King James II, became king upon Charles' death. King James was very unpopular and was deposed in 1688. King James' daughter, King James II's daughter, Mary, was the next in line to be the queen. Mary married her cousin, William of Orange, of the Netherlands, and William and Mary ruled until Mary died in 1694. King William continues to rule until his death in 1704. King James' younger daughter, Anne, was on the throne until her death in 1714. We'll see below that how the King Charles II, King James II, Queen Mary, King William, and Queen Anne will be important to our story that we go through in this chapter. A quick review of the early European claims on North America in the 1600s and the evolution of the British colonies hopefully will help explain some of the things I'll be discussing in this chapter. Although the lands were occupied by the Native Americans, early European explorers that I discussed in Chapter 2 laid claims to large parts of North America. The Spanish were the first to occupy territories in Brown, forming colonies using Spanish conquistadors supervised and funded by the Spanish king. France claimed the Green Territory and started colonies along the St. Lawrence River and along the Mississippi, and that was funded by the French king. Also, the French trappers pretty much on their own explored the territories in what is now Canada and along the Mississippi River. The English took a different approach. England was relatively poor, and the English King James was not willing to invest the royal funds to establish American colonies like the French and the Spanish kings did. Instead, he outsourced the development of the British colonies by granting charters to private stock companies or private individuals that would fund, manage, and hopefully make profit for themselves and their stockholders. Of course, the king would take his cut. Virginia and the New England colonies charters were granted by the king to corporate stock companies. Maryland was the proprietary charter was granted to Lord Baltimore. As we will see in later chapters, proprietary charters were granted to King William Penn of Pennsylvania for the Pennsylvania colony, and a combination of royal, corporate, and proprietary charters were granted to the southern colonies. Furthermore, during King Charles I and King Charles II's reign, the kings were distracted with the English Civil War and other problems in England and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what was happening in the colonies. So this outsourcing of establishing the colonies as opposed to directly funding and managing them had two significant effects on their development. First was that when the king saw things got out of hand and he felt that he had to intervene, he had a much harder time controlling the colonies. Second was that each colony developed in a very different way with different religions, political systems, laws, militia, and very little connection with each other. In fact, they pretty much treated each other as competing countries, which caused tremendous problems when they tried to come together to fight a common enemy in the French Indian Wars, or when they tried to establish the United States in 1776. This map shows the North American lands claimed by the English, French, and the Spanish in 1680. The area is similar to the area shown in the previous chart, except for the green area. A group of wealthy English merchants formed the Hudson Bay Company in 1670, and King Charles II granted the company fur trading and monopoly for all the lands drained by rivers flowing into the Hudson Bay. The land was called Prince Rupert's Land. You might remember the Englishman Henry Hudson explored the area and named it the Hudson Bay in 1609 and 1610, so I guess the English felt they had some claim to the area. The area was named after Prince Rupert of the Rhine, first cousin of King Charles II, and the first governor of the Hudson Bay Company. Out of curiosity, I wanted to see what good old King Charles II gave away to his cousin Rupert. We're all familiar with the Great Continental Divide, which is a line that separates water draining into the Gulf of Mexico on the east from water draining into the Pacific Ocean on the west. The map shows this area in red, and the other continental divides in North America as well. The Laurentian Divide in green separates the Hudson Bay watershed from the Gulf of Mexico watershed and the St. Lawrence watershed. The St. Lawrence watershed in magenta separates water flowing into the St. Lawrence River from the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. The Arctic Divide in blue separates the Hudson Bay watershed from the Arctic watershed. Now you can see the extent of the Hudson Bay watershed between the blue and the green lines on the map, and approximately highlighted by the dashed black oval. This area is slightly smaller than the continental United States, as shown by overlapping the Hudson Bay oval on the USA. Clearly, King Charles didn't know what he was giving away, or that good part of the Prince Rupert land was also claimed by France. Both French and English trappers inhabited this area, so the king's generosity was bound to cause problems. While you're looking at the map, you might notice the orange eastern line that separates the Atlantic watershed from the Gulf of Mexico watershed. It goes right through downtown Atlanta. We are living on top of this continental divide. It runs through downtown Atlanta and downtown Decatur. The blue lines on the map on the right show the driving path along the metropolitan Atlanta area will take you along the continental divide. The link is directions to this are given in the yellow box on the map. If you'd like to walk a small portion of it, it runs east-west through roughly along the College Avenue and the railroad tracks in Decatur. Okay, now back to New England. This map shows the state of the New England colonies at the beginning of this chapter of our story in 1677. New Haven colony had merged with the Connecticut colony in 1664. The New Hampshire and the Maine colonies were still part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. New Hampshire became a separate colony in 1679. The Province of Maine remained part of Massachusetts until it became a state in the U.S. in 1820. Plymouth Colony was still separate from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We'll see below that all of this will change shortly. As we have discussed, most of the original immigrant English ancestors were gone, and their children or grandchildren, most of whom had never been to England, were running the colonies by 1676. Massachusetts Bay Colony was the most troublesome colony for King Charles II. He had difficulty enforcing his laws and regulation in the Massachusetts Bay Colony because its corporate charter was a semi-independent private joint stock company that was designed by John Winthrop to make it a Puritan theocratic colony. Therefore, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was largely self-governing with its own Puritan House of Deputies, governor, and other self-appointed officers. The Puritan founders of Massachusetts colonies saw themselves as having divinely been given this land in the New World with a duty to establish a shining city on a hill and a Puritan theocratic government. In 1652, during Oliver Cromwell's reign, the Massachusetts Bay Company started minting their own currency, starting with the Pine Street shilling that greatly irritated King Charles when he found out about it after he became to power in 1660. The figure in the center shows the products that the New England colony were exporting. Many wealthy merchants and colonists saw that this conservative Puritan leadership thwarted their ability to expand this economic base and gain new customers for their goods. The king learned of these divisions and tried to address them. Originally, only Puritans approved by the colonial government were allowed to settle in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. As we discussed in Chapter 6, King Charles II opened the colony to non-Puritans by extending the right to vote to the Massachusetts Bay Colony to landowning non-Puritans in 1665. He hoped that including non-Puritans in the leadership would ease the internal conflict in the colony. By the 1680s, the non-Puritan population was growing, along with the tensions and conflicts concerning the future direction of the colony. Of course, the Orthodox Puritans were hostile to any changes in governments and the influx of non-Puritans into their colony. Unable to get the Massachusetts Bay Colony to obey his commands, King Charles II revoked his charter in 1684. He died shortly after in February of 1685, and his brother King James succeeded him as king. In 1686, King James created the Dominion of New England in order to tighten control over the New England colonies. King James combined the Massachusetts Bay Colony with other New England colonies in the Royal Dominion of New England, as seen in the red area on the right. This eliminated the colonial governments of Massachusetts Bay, New York, Connecticut, Plymouth, Rhode Island, and the New Jersey colonies. The Dominion replaced colonial representative assemblies and regular town meetings with Governor Edmund Andros, an all-powerful royal governor appointed by King James and backed by British imperial troops. Those colonists who had put their life earnings in a house and land and found that all their possessions had been relinquished to the crown. Puritan property titles were declared null and void, forcing landowners to buy new ones from the crown and pay feudal rents for the king in perpetuity. Governor Andros seized portions of town commons in Cambridge, Lynn, and other Massachusetts towns and gave the valuable plots to his friends. The court was virtually shut down, elections were postponed, colonial councils and general assemblies were forbidden to assemble. The purpose of creating the Dominion was to enforce the Navigation Act in the colonies, which prohibited them from trading directly with other countries not ruled by the British Crown, particularly with the Dutch, French, and Africa. The Dominion was extremely unpopular in New England. As depicted in the figure on the right, Massachusetts authorities arrested and jailed Governor Andros in Boston in April of 1689 and reestablished the Massachusetts Bay government under the rules of the vacated 1629 charter, without approval from England, which of course created total chaos. Until the new royal charter was issued by King William and Queen Mary 6 years later, Massachusetts Bay Colony's legal status was totally undefined. This was the situation that occurred in the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the Salem Witch Trials. We've seen that the English Civil War had a major impact on American colonies in the 1640s and 1650s. Similarly, the Glorious Revolution in England had a major impact on the New England colonies in 1688. King James was very unpopular in New England due to his handling of the Royal Dominion of New England and his conversion to Catholicism after his marriage to his second wife, Catherine of Bragada, a Catholic Italian princes. James also faced increasing opposition in England as a result of his tolerant policies towards Catholics. There was talk that he was trying to form an alliance with King Louis XIV of France, who was also Catholic. Many Englishmen feared the Catholic alliance between England and France would only strengthen Catholicism in Europe and establish a permanent Catholic monarchy in England. The general feeling in Parliament was that King James had to go, and they were looking for ways to get rid of him. King James' daughter, Mary, was heir to the throne. Mary was a Protestant, and her cousin William III was Protestant Prince of Orange in the Netherlands. The English Parliament invited William to invade England, depose King James, marry Mary, and have her succeed James as the Queen of England. The rule of succession for English kings and queens was that if the heir of the throne was male, he would become the king and his wife would be a queen consort. This means that she would have the title queen, but no power or an ability to succeed him if he died before her. If the heir was female, she became the queen and her husband would become a prince with no ability to succeed her if she died first. William of Orange agreed to the plan to overthrow King James, but with the condition that he would have full power of a king and could succeed Mary if she died first. The arrangement was agreed to by Parliament, and William and his army invaded England with no resistance, and this was called the Glorious Revolution. It was called the Glorious Revolution because King James was the last Catholic king of England. He was disposed and fled to France, and there would be no more Catholic kings or queens in England. After the Revolution, James and Louis XIV joined forces to take back England, the English throne, and reinstate Catholic rule in England. This created a power struggle between the King of France, Louis XIV, and King William III of England. The reference below provides information about the Glorious Revolution from English and the American point of view. The Glorious Revolution in England was one of the things that started the War of the Grand Alliance in Europe. The War of the Grand Alliance was the conflict between France and the European coalition, which mainly included the Holy Roman Empire, the Dutch Republic, the English, the Spanish, Savoy, and Portugal. The war spread to the colonies as a war between the French-American colonists, the English-American colonists, and the Native Americans. The war was called the King William War, and also called the First French Indian War. It can be seen from the chart at the bottom that there were 4 wars in the colonies involving the French colonists, the Native Americans, and the British colonists. Since all of these wars were between the French colonists, the Indians, and American colonists, they were all called the 4 French Indian War. In the chart, you can see the names of the wars of the colonists is highlighted in blue, and the names of the European War is highlighted in red. The First French Indian War started in 1688 and lasted until 1697. The Second French Indian War, the Queen Anne War, started in 1702 and lasted until 1713. You can see that there's a 31-year gap between the Queen Anne War and the Third French Indian War, the King George War, which started in 1644. The Fourth French Indian War was the decisive one, which we'll cover in a future chapter. I'm only going to talk about the 2 French Indian Wars. The map shows the areas occupied by the French colonists in blue and the New England colonists in red in 1697. The disputed areas are shown in the stripes, and these are mostly the King Rupert's Land that we talked about earlier, or Prince Rupert's Land that we talked about earlier. The yellow diamonds show the French settlements along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes enclosed in the red ovals. The New England areas along the Atlantic coast are closed in the yellow ovals. The striped areas were claimed by both France and England. The gray areas were not inhabited by Europeans at the time. Tensions were high between New France and New England over the fur trade, and disputes over territory held over from the King Philip War. Tensions were also growing between the Indians, the European colonists, over continuous encroachment of the English and the French colonists into Indian territories. Unlike the King Philip War, the King William War was an international war. The map shows on the areas in North America and Canada claimed by the English in blue and the areas claimed by the French in pink. The English and French armies were embroiled in the wars in Grand Alliance and unable to send troops to the colonies, so that the King William War was mostly fought between the New France settlers and the New England colonists. There were approximately 150,000 English settlers at the beginning of the war, and they outnumbered the French 12 to 1. However, the English were divided into multiple colonies along the Atlantic, and only the New England colonies fought in this war. The English population amounted to about 14,000. The New France was divided into three entities: Acacia on the Atlantic coast, the settlements along the St. Lawrence River and up the Great Lakes, and a few settlements from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico along the Mississippi River. Although the French were vastly outnumbered, they were more politically unified and contained a disproportionate number of adult males with military backgrounds. Realizing their numerical inferiority, the French developed good relations with indigenous people in order to multiply their forces and make effective use of hit-and-run guerrilla tactics. The new French settlers successfully recruited the Englishmen who had survived the King Philip War. The British campaigns are shown in the blue dashed lines and the French campaigns in red. The English colonies attacked Montreal and Quebec and parts of Nova Scotia. The French attacked several areas in Massachusetts Bay and the New York colonies. The French Indian allies were the Wabanaki Confederacy, shown in the map on the left, and the English allies were the Iroquois Confederacy, shown in the map on the right. The King William War ended with no significant changes in the border between New France and the British colonies. The map shows the land was actually settled by the French along the St. Lawrence River and the Mississippi River in blue, the Spanish Florida in orange, and the American Southwest, and the English along the Atlantic coast in red. The French gained some territory in Acadia, but the striped areas of Rupert's Land, Newfoundland, and northern Massachusetts were still in dispute between the French and the English. However, the war did have a significant impact on our Massachusetts Bay ancestors, as we will see below. The French Indian attack sent waves of English refugees from what is now Maine into the more settled areas of the New Hampshire Bay Colony, including Salem Village. These displaced people created a strain on the Salem Village resources, increasing the tensions. Several of the young refugee girls who had been made orphans by the Indian attacks in northern New England fled to Salem Village and became accusers in the Salem Witch Trials. Also, Indian allies with the French attacked Groton in 1694 and 1707, killing or kidnapping some of our ancestors, which we'll discuss later in this chapter. After William and Mary came to power in England, King William III issued a new royal charter in 1691. The map on the right shows the evolution of the New England charters. The area between the green lines shows the original Plymouth Charter. The blue lines outline the 1629 Massachusetts Bay Charter, and the yellow and green lines outlined in the red oval show the extent of the province of Massachusetts as established by William and Mary in 1691. The new charter disbanded the Dominion of New England, restored Connecticut, Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey colonies, created the province of Massachusetts by merging the Massachusetts Bay with the Plymouth colony, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and territories roughly encompassed Maine, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. Extended the voting rights to non-Puritans who owned 40 pounds of real estate and earned at least 2 pounds per year. Declared that the senior officials of the government, including the governor, the lieutenant governor, and judges, were appointed by the Crown instead of being elected by the colonists. The General Assembly, like our House of Representatives, was elected by the colonists, but the government could veto their decisions. We talked briefly about our 8th great-grandfather William Bond when we introduced the Winthrop Fleet passengers in Chapter 5. He comes out of our 2nd great-grandmother Elizabeth Bennet's branch of our tree. William was born in Suffolk, England in 1625. At age 5, he came to America with his aunt Elizabeth Bond and her husband Ephraim Child as part of the Winthrop Fleet. He was the founder of Watertown. He married Sarah Biscoe in Watertown in 1649. He was a justice of peace and a selectman in Watertown. He was the captain of the Horse Cavalry in King Philip's War. And in 1679, he was assigned to help rebuild Lancaster after the King Philip War. After the charter formed by the province of Massachusetts was issued in 1691, 8th great-grandfather William Bond was elected Speaker of the newly created General Assembly and served there until his death in 1695. The final subject I want to introduce before discussing the Salem Witch Trials is slavery in New England. Slavery in New England started with the colonists sold captured Indians as slaves to the West Indies. The Indian slavery led directly to African slavery. The first blacks imported to New England were in 1638. And they were brought to from the West Indies in exchange for Native American slaves. As I mentioned in Chapter 6, the Massachusetts Bay Company was the first colony to legalize slavery in 1641. By 1700, there were about 400 slaves in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Most of the time, they were house servants or worked on small farms. We'll see that one of these slaves was a key player in the Salem Witch Trials. You might remember in Chapter 4 when I talked about 14th great-grandfather William Hawkins establishing a triangular trade route between England, Africa, and the Portuguese American colonies. By 1600s, that trade continued to expand to include the British American settlements in the West Indies and the British colonies in North America. The map shows a rectangular slave trade route between England, Africa, West Indies, and British colonies in the 1600s. The blue arrows show the trade from Africa to the West Indies and from England to the American colonies. The red arrows show the trade from the West Indies to England, from American colonies to Africa, and from the American colonies to England. The purple arrow shows the trade between the West Indies and the British American colonies. In the 1660s, King Charles created the Royal African Company to bring this trade in enslavement of people and African goods under his control. His brother James led the company before ascending to the throne in 1685. Under both of these kings, the Royal African Company enjoyed a monopoly on transport of enslaved people to the English colonies. Between 1672 and 1713, the company brought 125,000 captives on the African coast to the colonies. The Royal African Company monopoly ended in 1689. After that date, many more English merchants engaged in the slave trade and greatly increased the number of enslaved people being transported to America. Africans usually arrived in the West Indies, often in Barbados. From there, they were transported to the mainland England colonies in company ships. This chart shows the slave population in the British American colonies in 1680 and in 1740. The blue numbers are for 1680 and the red numbers are for 1740. Note, all colonies had slaves at this time. The histogram at the bottom left shows the growth in the slave population between 1640 and 1780 for all the American colonies. Notice the Massachusetts Bay Colony had about 170 slaves in 1640, but over 3,000 by 1740. The major slave trade centers in the early 1700s are shown in the red dots. They were Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond, Charleston, and Savannah. This graph shows the number of whites in purple and enslaved Africans in yellow in the British colonies in 1750. The northern colonies above the dashed line had very few slaves, shown in yellow. The southern colonies below the line had considerably more slaves than provided labor for their plantations. It's interesting to note that South Carolina, Jamaica, and Barbados had more slaves than whites. I have much more to say about slavery when I talk about the Civil War in the future chapter. I've added this information now because one of the instigators of the hysteria that started the Salem Witch Trials was a slave from Barbados. Okay, now on to the witches. The translation of Exodus 22:18 in the King James Bible states, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." This was the Bible passage the Puritans and other Christians long before them used to justify executing a person accused of witchcraft. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony published the Body of Liberties. These 100 rules, which were the basis based on both English law and biblical law, were intended to be the foundation of the colony's court system. Rule 94, Capital Laws, number 2 states, "If a man or a woman be a witch, that hath consulteth with a familiar spirit, they shall be put to death." However, few people were executed for witchcraft before the Salem Witch Trials. Instead, juries were reluctant to convict, or the accused was given a sentence for lighter offenses. However, as Bob Dylan states, the times they were changing in the early 80s and early 1680s and the 90s. The Salem Witch Trials were a very interesting and important part of our story because it's an example of how our ancestors being caught right in the middle of these dramatic changes. Two most famous characters of their story were non-pedigree ancestors, Giles and Martha Corey, who were executed. We have 16 ancestors who were caught up in the Salem Witch Trials, whom I will introduce below. I'll start with a brief review of the witch trials in Europe and the American colonies that preceded the Salem Witch Trials. I'll follow by showing how the historical events and the Puritans' beliefs we discussed in Chapter 5 contribute to the tensions that were building in Salem Village before the trials started. After that, I'll introduce our ancestors and the roles they played in the trials. The part on the right provides a good summary of the witch trials in Europe that preceded the Salem Witch Trials. The histogram shows the number of witch trials in Europe by country from 1300 to 1850. The light green lines are the number accused, and the dark green lines are the number convicted and executed. The column on the left with orange bubbles indicates the number of trials per 100,000 people in each country. The graph on the lower right plots the number of trials and executions by year. The reference below is the source for this information on this chart and the next several charts. The chart provides the same information as on the previous chart, but in tabular form. According to the table, over 60% of all trials took place in Germany and Switzerland. However, Germany and Switzerland were not separate countries in the 1600s, but part of the Holy Roman Empire that we discussed in Chapter 2. The map on the right shows the extent of the Holy Roman Empire in purple in the 1600s. The graph is an expansion of the graph on the lower right-hand side of the earlier chart that plots the number of people tried and number convicted per year. The Holy Roman Empire was breaking apart into separate countries in the 1600s, and there was tremendous competition between Catholics and Protestants for converts. The part of the graph shaded in gray highlights the time between the beginning of Luther's Protestant Reformation and the beginning of the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire into predominantly Protestant and Catholic countries. I added the red box, which shows when the 30-Year War occurred. It was when the most intense fighting to determine which countries would be Protestant and which would be Catholic occurred. The 30 Years' War was a 17th century religious conflict fought primarily in the Holy Roman Empire. It remains one of the longest and most brutal wars in human history, with more than 8 million casualties resulting from military battles as well as from famine and disease caused by the conflict. The war lasted from 1618 to 1648, starting as a battle among Catholic and Protestants who formed the Holy Roman Empire. In the end, the conflicts changed the geopolitical face of Europe and the role of religion in the nation states and the society. The number of witch trials in Europe peaked during the 30 Years' War. It was a very turbulent time in Europe, as we discussed in Chapter 2. The Salem Witch Trials occurred well after the witch trials in Europe peaked, but at a time when Salem was undergoing a tremendous upheaval. The table shows the number of witch trials and gender of the accused in the British American colonies. 73% of the trials occurred in the Puritan Massachusetts Bay Colony. 74 of the accused witches were female. Older women were particularly easy victims for accusations of witchcraft. They had no financial or political power. They were considered the weaker sex and therefore more susceptible to the temptations of the devil. Many served as midwives and used herbal potions, relaxation techniques, and other methods not condoned or understood by the men doctors at a time to help women in labor. Those who could not conceive or had stillborn babies were considered to be cursed by God or possessed by the devil. One more thing before we get into the Salem Witch Trials with our ancestors. We had an ancestor who was about 20 years ahead of her time. We've already discussed ninth great-grandfather William Knapp and ninth great-grandmother Judith II, who came to Massachusetts colony with the Winthrop fleet in 1630. William's son, eighth great-grand-uncle James Knapp, and eighth great-grand-aunt Elizabeth Warren had a daughter, first cousin, 8 times removed, Elizabeth Knapp. Reverend Samuel Willard was the Groton's minister at the time. In the winter of 1671 and 72, while working as a servant for Reverend Willard, 16-year-old Elizabeth Knapp started exhibiting violent demonic behavior. Eighth great-grandfather, Captain James Parker, who we discussed in Chapter 6, was an influential leader of Groton at the time and recognized the potential danger of the situation. Rather than accusing her of being a witch, Captain Parker, Reverend Willard, and the local doctor treated and counseled Elizabeth. Over a period of several months, she returned to normal. Her spells were a prototype of the behavior exhibited by young Salem girls who started the Salem Witch Trials in 1692. Elizabeth's case was discussed in depth in the book Witches by Stacy Schiff. 20 years later, Reverend Willard came to Massachusetts Salem Village, and was a leading force in bringing the Salem Witch Trials to an end. Our eighth great-grandmother, Mary Knapp, James' sister, had a daughter, seventh great-grandmother, Sarah Smith Buckley, who was accused of being a witch during the Salem Witch Trials, and we'll discuss her a little bit later in this chapter. I'll read a short extraction from Stacy Schiff's book describing Elizabeth Knapp's behavior. In 1791, Reverend Samuel Willard, 16-year-old servant, began to roar and shriek, erupt in immoderate and extravagant laughter, engage in foolish and apic gestures, and leap about the house. She fell, wailing on the ground. She found herself alternately strangled and senseless. She endured 48-hour-long fits of such intensity that 6 men could not restrain her. Elizabeth Knapp saw enchanted creatures in the fireplace. It was all a reprise of Salem, except that it occurred 20 years earlier. Elizabeth Knapp barked like a dog, bleated like a calf, drowned out prayer. She struck at and spit in the faces of adults who tended her. Elizabeth had many visitors that winter, and Willard noted that her afflictions peaked under the observation and grew more violent as the crowd increases. No one spent as much time with her or came in for as much abuse as Reverend Willard. He devoted full days to the 16-year-old, praying with her, reasoning with her, and counseling her. She accused a respectable neighbor of having bewitched her. She acknowledged having signed a satanic pact. The devil had promised her money, silks, fine clothes, ease in labor, and to show her the whole world. In the reprise between the fits, she wept uncontrollably. She confessed to a cascade of sins. She had snarled at her parents, neglected prayers, contemplated suicide. Willard remained calm throughout, even though Elizabeth revealed that the devil had instructed her to murder the minister and his children. Elizabeth eventually recovered, and no one was hung or tried for witchcraft. My good luck with finding good reference material is holding up. Stacy Schiff's book, Witches, is an excellent reference for the Salem Witch Trials, and Diane Fold's book, Death in Salem, provides good biographies of all of the participants in the Salem Witch Trials. Well, since I didn't have a song for this chapter, I thought a few quotes seemed appropriate to begin our discussion of the Salem Witch Trials. Stacy Schiff used Anton Chekhov's quote as an epigram for the beginning of her book, Witches. We will declare that nothing is clear in this world. Only fools and charlatans know and understand everything. Around 1400 BC, Socrates said the only true wisdom is knowing that you know nothing. Stacy Schiff summed up the Salem Witch Trials story in her book with Salem is part of the story of what happens when a set of unanswerable questions meets a set of unquestioned answers. These quotes provide a good definition of fundamentalism, where you think you know everything you need to know and aren't open to more information and won't allow questioning of your beliefs. This is the thought process that led the Puritans to the Salem Witch Trials. Events leading up to 1692 that I've discussed above created the perfect storm for hysteria of the Salem Witch Trials. Changes that were occurring in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1680s and the 1690s were very destabilizing for the Puritans of Salem Village. King Charles II had canceled the Massachusetts Bay Charter in 1684 and then died in 1685. King James succeeded King Charles and created the Royal Dominion of New England and merged all of the New England colonies together and appointed Edwin Andrews as a governor. All the colonists' property was confiscated and the colonists were required to pay rent to the king. This led to rebellion against the new governor in 1689 that further raised the tensions all over the Massachusetts Bay Colony. A new charter in May of 1692, created by King William III, formed the province of Massachusetts, coming during the Salem Witch Trials, further destabilizing the citizens and significantly reducing the power of the Puritans. The loss of power caused the fundamental Puritans to think that God was angry with them, and they started looking for who in their community had offended God. The Puritans strongly believed in the existence of the devil and witches and witchcraft. Witches were blamed for all sorts of problems and misfortunes, from illness and failed crops to bad weather and other things that had perfectly rational explanations even 4 centuries ago. The threat of Indian attacks from the King William War and the influx of refugees from these attacks put an economic burden on the village and introduced outsiders that increased attention to the tight-knit community of Salem Village. There were existing rivalries between wealthy families looking forward with ties to the wealth of the Port of Salem and those who were more conservative, still depending on agriculture in Salem Village. Some of the villages were pushing for more autonomy while the others were fighting it. Controversy also brewed over Reverend Samuel Parris, who became the village's first ordained minister in 1689 and was disliked by many of the more ribald villages for his dogmatic ways and greedy nature. The climate in Salem Village and the surrounding villages appeared to be a very local, time-compressed version of the climate that existed in Europe 30 years during the 30 Years' War, when a number of witchcrafts peaked in Europe. It took the actions of an unpopular dogmatic preacher, a few young girls behaving strangely, and a slave woman from Barbados to trigger the hysteria that started the accusations that occurred within Salem Village. Before we talk about our ancestors, I need to explain the difference between Salem Village and Salem Town. The Salem Witch Trials didn't start in Salem Town as is commonly believed. They started in Salem Village. Adjacent to Salem Town where many of our ancestors lived. Salem Village is outlined in red and Salem Town is outlined in blue on the map. Ipswich Road was the boundary between Salem Town and Salem Village. The brown squares on the map indicate where the accusers lived, and the black triangles show where the accused lived. Note that most of the accusers lived farther from Salem Town and the accused closer into Salem Town. Originally, the territory that became Salem Village consisted of small farms on the outskirts of Salem. The town of Salem was a prosperous port town engaged in commerce, fishing, shipbuilding, and other activities associated with trading between the colonies, England, and the Caribbean. The village, roughly 5 to 7 miles from Salem's meeting house, consisted in effect of a parish ward of a town or served as an agricultural hinterland. The population of Salem Town, which at the time of the witch trials was estimated to be about 2,000 residents. The population of Salem Village numbered between 500 and 600 residents. As the village grew, it began to develop a distinctive identity and separate interests from the town. By about 1670, the farmers in Salem Village requested their own church due to the distance they had to travel for church in Salem. Some villagers thought, but by no means all, that a separate church represented a broader ambition for the greater autonomy and even complete independence from Salem Town. Salem Town's residents initially objected to the farmers' request, but in March 1672, by the push from the colonial government, the town granted the village the liberty to hire a minister for themselves. However, Salem Village was responsible for hiring the minister, paying his salary, and providing his housing. The village was also permitted to establish a committee to assess and gather the taxes to support the ministry. In 1689, after a period of negotiation, the village hired Reverend Samuel Parris, and on November 19th of 1689, he took over. This is where the trouble really began. The Salem Witch Trials began in the dead of winter in February of 1692 and lasted until May of 1693. More than 185 people in 25 villages were accused of being witches. 55 confessed, and 19 people and 2 dogs were convicted and executed. The 55 confessed because the confessed witches were imprisoned but not hanged if they denounced the devil. 1 was crushed to death. At least 8 accused, including 2 young children and an aged widow, died in the squalid prison conditions awaiting trial. The youngest accused was 5 years old, and the oldest was over 80. We have 16 ancestors who were involved in the Salem Witch Trials. 3 were executed, 1 was tortured to death, 1 was convicted but spared execution due to pregnancy, 1 who was convicted but survived because the trial was over before she was scheduled for execution. 5 were accused, jailed, and finally acquitted. 2 were accused but escaped before their trial. 1 was born in prison where his mother was being held. 1 stood up to accusers and his family and defended the accused and helped others escape. Another also helped others escape, and 1 testified at the trial, helping to get in the trial and helped get the Salem minister, Reverend Parris, fired. If the tensions in the colony were already bad enough, there were some more things that were happening in Salem village to add even more. 2 of the most powerful families in the village, the Putnams and the Porters, had been feuding for years, and by 1692 the situation came to a head. John Porter is our 8th great-grandfather. His daughter, 7th great-grandmother Sarah Porter, married 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews. The senior Putnams were not ancestors, but were wealthy farmers who followed the simple, austere life of the traditional Puritans. Although the Porters derived much of their wealth from the agricultural operations in Salem village, they also were entrepreneurs who developed commercial interest in Salem town and throughout New England and the Caribbean. The Porters' diversified business interests allowed them to increase their family wealth, while the Putnams' family wealth was stagnating. The interfamily rivalry began in 1672 when a dam for a sawmill owned by the Porters and operated by Joseph Hutchinson broke and flooded the Putnam farms. The flood resulted in a bitter lawsuit between the Putnams and the Porters. A few years later, the Putnams petitioned the town to obtain political independence for the village, and the Porters opposed the separation. Thomas Putnam Sr. married Anne Holyoke, and they had Thomas Putnam Jr. in 1651. Anne died in 1665, and Tom married Mary Ingersoll, and they had Joseph Putnam in 1669. When Thomas Putnam Jr. died in 1686, he left most of his estate to Joseph, which made his half-brother Thomas very resentful. Despite the family rivalries, 7th great-aunt Elizabeth Porter, daughter of 8th great-grandfather John Porter and sister of 7th great-grandmother Elizabeth Porter and 7th great-uncle Joseph Porter, married Joseph Putnam, half-brother of Thomas Putnam, in 1690. The marriage further infuriated Thomas Putnam Jr., since he thought that Sarah Porter was benefiting from his rightful inheritance. The arrival of Reverend Samuel Parris in 1689 intensified the Putnam-Porter conflict, since the Putnams supported him and the Porters did not and refused to pay the taxes to support him. I put an orange box around Thomas Jr., his wife Ann Carr, and their daughter Ann Jr. because they accused more people of witchcraft than any other citizens of the Salem village. Members of the Porter family attempted to mobilize the village against the trials, but were stymied when 19 of their family and close associates found themselves facing witchcraft allegations. In the spring of 1691, the sitting committee was made up of supporters of Reverend Samuel Parris, who had arrived in 1689. 26 villagers, 11 of whom were Putnams, voted to give Reverend Parris a parsonage, a barn, and 2 acres of land. Some villagers thought that these gifts were too generous. Nathaniel and John Putnam, brothers of Thomas Putnam Jr., were selected as town selectmen. 7th great-uncle Israel Porter, 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews, and several others resigned in protest. 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews and his brother-in-law Joseph Porter were 2 of the 4 villagers who asked for a special committee to address these grievances. They were particularly curious about why the parsonage had been transferred to Reverend Parris when he became a minister. In October 1691, the old committee members were voted out and new committee members voted in, including those who were openly hostile to Reverend Samuel Parris. The new committee consisted of Daniel Andrews, son-in-law of John Porter Sr., Francis Nurse, a village farmer, and Rebecca Nurse's husband, who had been involved in a bitter boundary dispute with the Putnams, Joseph Putnam, half-brother of Thomas Putnam, Joseph Hutchinson, the sawmill operator the Porters had blamed for flooding their farm. The new committee quickly voted down the tax levy that would have raised the revenue to pay the salary of Reverend Parris. The committee served during the entire period of the witch trials. The afflictions of the young Salem village girls began 3 months after, in February of 1792. I mentioned above that the refugees from the King William War migrated to Salem Village after they were attacked by Indians in northern Massachusetts, which is now part of the state of Maine. Some of these young girls, who became hysterical and started accusing their fellow citizens of witchcraft in the Salem Village, had experienced these Indian attacks. Some were kidnapped by raiding Indians and returned for ransom. They all had witnessed their parents and other family members being killed and scalped by Indians. The surviving orphaned and homeless girls had no alternatives but to become domestic servants. They were sent to Salem Village to be indentured servants for the homes of the well-to-do Puritan villagers. These young, traumatic orphan girls who needed to be nurtured and cared for were instead sent to live with the strangers, overworked and treated almost like slaves by their Puritan masters. For them, days were passed sweating over another family's household with little to show for it but a bowl of porridge, a change of clothes, and a place to sleep. Okay, I've laid the groundwork. Now we'll talk about the trials and our ancestors who were affected by them. The people I will talk about fall into 5 different categories, which I will introduce in the following order: the preachers, the accusers, the accused, the judges, and the defenders of those who are accused. We have ancestral connections to people in the last 3 categories. We'll see that in several cases our ancestors in the different categories are closely related to each other and to the accusers. We'll start with the preachers. I've already talked about one of the preachers, Reverend Samuel Willard, the minister who treated Elizabeth Knapp when she exhibited symptoms like the young girls in Salem Villages 20 years earlier in Groton. He came to Salem Village in 1692 to help put the end to the Salem Witch Trials. Now we'll introduce a minister who did the opposite. He was partially responsible for the witch hysteria in Salem Village. The picture on the right is a portrait of Samuel Parris. By the way, it's very unusual for a lowly minister at that time to have his portrait painted. Samuel Parris was a 39-year-old minister of Salem Village, was at the center of the Salem Witch Trials phenomenon. Born to a London cloth merchant, he sailed to Boston in the 1660s and studied at Harvard. Upon his father's death in 1673, he dropped out of school and traveled to Barbados to collect his inheritance, including a sugar plantation his father owned. Parris' efforts to run the plantation were plagued by bad luck from the very start. At one point, a hurricane wrecked the warehouse and destroyed his inventory, and consistently low sugar prices steadily decreased his profits. After 8 years of struggling, he and his wife, Elizabeth, decided to leave the island and make a new start in Boston. After failing at another business venture, Parris began searching for a post as a minister in New England. He began preaching at local churches, and after a long period of negotiation, accepted the Salem Village pulpit in 1689. At first, the congregation was impressed with his religious orthodoxy, but gradually they soured on him. He was rough with his slaves, openly self-serving, and even though the Salem villagers paid him a decent salary and providing his housing and all his firewood, he demanded more. Parris exuded a sense of entitlement, insisting that he owned the title of the parsonage, which would leave the village without a parsonage if he left or was fired. As time passed, the dispute deepened, dividing the village into 2 factions. The more conservative villagers sided with Parris, while the more prosperous ones opposed him. After opponents had stopped contributing their share to his salary, the tensions increased even further. At the time of 1692 trials, the winter was extremely brutal, led to crop failures and shortages of firewood and game and fish. Parris, consumed with worry over his financial debts, his food running low, and his firewood almost gone, was at an emotional impasse. The photo on the left is the parsonage where Samuel Parris and his family lived in Salem Village. The house where the witchcraft started, a photograph of the Salem Village Parsonage, home of Samuel Parris in Danvers, Massachusetts, was published in Witchcraft Illustrated by Henrietta Kimball, circa 1892. The name Salem Village was later changed to Danvers when it became an independent village after the witch trials. The house in the picture is an addition to what was added to the parsonage in 1734. The original parsonage house was torn down in 1784, and this addition was moved to Sylvan Street in Danvers. The original site of an archaeological excavation of the parsonage that began in 1970 can be visited at the Salem Witchcraft Museum in Salem. The link to the museum is given in the lower reference. The picture on the right is the historical marker describing what took place in the parsonage during the witch trials. We'll cover all those events below. The first accuser was probably Reverend Parris' niece and daughter. The most ruthless was probably Reverend Parris' 12-year-old niece, Abigail Williams. An orphan of the Indian Wars, Abigail was taken in by her uncle and became the family's live-in servant. Being the oldest girl, she would probably have been kept busy spinning yarn and doing chores most of these days and into the evening. She and Reverend Parris' 9-year-old daughter, Betty, probably shared a bed and said their prayers, hoping not to anger Betty's volatile father. A mostly distant man, Parris would have had little inclination to comfort his grief-stricken niece. Nor would his wife Elizabeth offer much solace because she was ill most of the time. The difficult period in her life, Abigail had no one to turn to but young Betty and Tituba, the family's Caribbean slave. Historically, the number of trials in Europe peaked in the dead of winter. In January of 1692, tensions in Salem Village were high. Each day was a cold, gloomy, snowy repetition of the day before. Food was short, firewood was almost gone. Cooped up in a chilly house, Abigail probably felt restless. She perhaps told Betty horrific stories of being attacked by Indians, or persuaded Tituba to tell them the fortunes or tales of voodoo. In February of 1692, Abigail began to exhibit strange symptoms like the ones Elizabeth Knapp had 21 years earlier in Groton. Soon after, Betty Parris exhibited the same symptoms. William Grace, the 71-year-old conservative Puritan doctor, was called to examine the girls. He found nothing physically wrong with them and diagnosed that they had been bewitched. Reverend Parris insisted that Abigail and Betty identify the witches who cast spells on them. They named Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne. Tituba was Parris' slave that had been brought from the Barbados. Sarah Good was a raggedy and filthy, foul-smelling, pipe-smoking beggar who roamed Salem Village with her 5-year-old daughter and was pregnant again. In a society that viewed wealth as a sign of God's blessing, Sarah Good was considered to have offended God in some way. Sarah Osborne lived unmarried with her young indentured servant and seized her late husband's assets, which he had willed to his sons. In addition, she had not been to church for some time and suffered from an illness that left her partially bedridden. These three women were easy targets with no status in the community and no resources to defend themselves. The number of afflicted sub-teen and teenage girls soon increased to 17. Later, some of their parents also became accusers. The afflicted girls were normally present during the courtroom proceedings, and when an accused witch entered the room, the afflicted girls invariably collapsed in traumatic fits of hysteria that only ceased when the accused took the witness stand. In contrast to the dignified courtroom decorum demanded by most U.S. judges today, the Salem Witch Trials were confronted by belligerent magistrates, rabid witnesses, and hysterical spectators in the gallery. They barked and yelped, their bodies shuddered and spun, they went limp or sporadically rigid. The paralyzed postures altered with frantic, indecipherable gestures. The girls launched into foolish, ridiculous speech which neither they nor others could understand. They crept into holes or under chairs and stools from which they were extracted with difficulty. Abigail Williams attempted to launch herself into the air, flinging her arms and making flying noises. None appeared to have time for prayer, though through January they had all been perfectly well-behaved young women. At night, they slept like babies. The evidence offered to incriminate the defendants typically reflected the medieval superstitions of the Puritan community. 9 witches were convicted on the strength of spectral evidence alone. I'll define spectral evidence further on the next chart. Other defendants were convicted on the basis they could not properly recite the Lord's Prayer, they owned mysterious voodoo-type dolls and puppets, or they suffered from a reputation for witchcraft in their community. Jurors were also told that unusual growth marks on the accused bodies represented signs of intimate relationships with the devil. Spectral evidence refers to a witness testimony that the accused person's spirit, spectral shape, or ghost appeared to the witness in a dream or a vision at the time the accused person's physical body was at another location. Spectral evidence had not been allowed in the Massachusetts General Court before the 1629 charter was revoked, but was allowed in the special court set up for the witch trials. The mission of the victims' conjectures were governed only by the limit of their imagination and fears, whether or not objectively proven it with facts were forthcoming to justify them. The evidence was accepted on the basis that the devil and his minions were powerful enough to send their spirit or specters to pure religious people in order to lead them astray. I showed a tree that diagrammed the connection between the Putnams and the Porters. The picture on the left is the Putnam's house. 8 members of the Putnam family were involved in the prosecution of the approximately 60 witches. Thomas Putnam Jr. signed 10 legal complaints against the defendants and provided testimony against 24 accused witnesses. His wife, Anne Carr Putnam, who will be referred to as Anne Putnam Sr., was the most prominent adult citizen among those who were reportedly afflicted by witchcraft. Tom Putnam Jr.'s daughter, Anne Jr., was the most prolific accuser, providing testimony against 48 accused witnesses. Many historians believe the Putnam family used the witchcraft hysteria in Salem Village to get revenge against their rivals and enemies. The Putnams were a source of witchcraft allegations against all of our accused ancestors. The eldest child of Thomas Putnam Jr., Anne Putnam Jr., was raised in a climate of sorrow and bitterness. Both parents, Thomas and Anne Putnam, felt they had been cheated out of their rightful inheritances. To make matters worse, it seemed as if a curse had been laid upon Anne Sr. She lost several newborn children. Their fortune was dwindling, and yet, instead of confronting the family's members responsible for their financial misfortunes, Anne Jr.'s parents channeled their frustrations into the Salem witch hunt, using Anne as their pawn. Anne's father initiated almost half of the formal complaints filed against suspected witches, feeding their names and alleged crimes to his daughter. Though only 12, Anne Jr. would become one of the most obsessive accusers, claiming specters were biting and pinching her. Her mother sometimes joined in the frenzied hysterics, slashing out at innocent victims who disagreed with the family's accusations. Anne Jr.'s name appeared more than 400 times in the legal documents. Before it was over, she would accuse 19 and see 11 hang. This drawing shows Tituba, the Paris slave, entertaining the young girls with stories from the Caribbean. Tituba was the first person to be accused of practicing witchcraft by Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. What was certain is that Tituba was a woman of color and likely an indigenous Central American who was an enslaved worker at the house of Samuel Paris. Reverend Paris brought Tituba from Barbados, and she had been enslaved since her capture during her childhood. The people of Salem associated supernatural practices like voodoo with people of color and Caribbean islanders. The townspeople identified Tituba as both. It's been theorized that Tituba told the girls fortunes and entertained them with tales of voodoo and casting spells prior to the accusations. Tituba was allowed to speak against her accusers at the trial. She was the first person to confess to practicing witchcraft in Salem Village in March of 1692. She also said she was beaten by Reverend Paris, who told her to confess to witchcraft, which she did. And what she confessed was culturally European, not African or Caribbean. Tituba's testimony was bizarre and deeply disturbing to the people of Salem. Tituba was also confessed to speaking with the devil. She stated that he ordered her to worship him and hurt the children of the village. She confessed to signing the devil's book, flying in the air on a broom, seeking cats, wolves, birds, and dogs, and pinching and choking some of the affected girls. Her forced confession was enough to convince the town that evil was afoot. It was all too easy for scapegoat people of color and marginal members of the society. She was convicted as a detestable witch. She was not executed because she confessed, but languished in jail for more than a year because Reverend Parris refused to pay her bail. Eventually, an anonymous person, possibly a slave trader, paid Tituba's bail. She was released after 13 months in jail and was never heard from again. Accusations quickly spread to the neighboring villages. Salem Village, circled in red, is labeled Danvers on the map. The name was changed to Danvers when it became a separate village after the witch trials. The tags show the number of accused in villages surrounding Salem Village. There were 16 in Salem Village, 23 in Salem, 9 in Gloucester, 6 in Topfield, 5 in Raleigh, 6 in Haverhill, 45 in Andover, 7 in Reading, and 5 in Lynn. Most of our witches lived in Salem Village. The village with the most accused witches was Andover, and the last to be accused of witchcraft came from Gloucester. We have 12 ancestors who were accused of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials. They are Daniel Andrews, Rebecca Nurse, Giles Corey, Martha Corey, John Proctor, William Proctor, Sarah Proctor, Benjamin Proctor, Elizabeth Bennett, Sarah Smith, Sarah Buckley, Mary Perkins, and I'll tell each of their stories below. 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews comes out of the Corey side of our tree through 2nd great-grandmother Elizabeth Bennett's wife of 2nd great-grandfather Aaron Corey, and through Thomas Dodge and Sarah Andrews. He married 7th great-grandmother Sarah Porter. He was our first pedigree ancestor to be accused of witchcraft. The yellow boxes show our pedigree ancestors. 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews was born to 8th great-grandfather Thomas Andrews and 8th great-grandmother Rebecca Craddock in Watertown, Massachusetts in 1643. He married 7th great-grandmother Sarah Porter, daughter of 8th great-grandfather John Porter Sr. Daniel moved to Salem Village in 1669. Sarah Porter was the sister of Joseph Porter, who we'll talk about shortly. Working as a bricklayer, Daniel was involved in many projects in Salem Village, such as the building of the new town hall and other buildings for the community. Through an inheritance from 8th great-grandfather John Porter Sr., Andrews and Sarah received a large parcel of land, helping them become the 4th wealthiest couple in Salem Village. Daniel was active in the community, serving as a juryman in the years 1676, 1681, and 1684. He also served as town selectman several years and constable in 1677. As discussed above, John was a member of the village committee that refused to approve the raise for Reverend Parris, or giving him the title to the parsonage. Accusations against Daniel were orchestrated by the powerful Putnam family. Rumblings began in April, the same month that he was selected to the town as the town selectman. Daniel Andrews was accused of witchcraft in the spring of 1692. Among his accusers were Ann Putnam Jr. and Abigail Williams. The girls likely got their target list from Thomas Putnam Jr. and Samuel Parris. On May 14th, a complaint was filed and the arrest warrant was issued for Daniel Andrews. When the constable, John Putnam, arrived at Daniel Andrews' home, he discovered that Daniel had fled. Daniel returned to Salem Village after the hysteria died down. He resumed his role as selectman in 1701 and 1702, and died also in 72. Daniel and Sarah were the parents of 6th great-grandmother Sarah Andrews. The story of Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged, is probably the saddest of all. Our connection to Rebecca is through 7th great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell III and 7th great-grandmother Hannah Longley. They had sons, 6th great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell IV and 6th great-granduncle John Tarbell. 6th great-granduncle John Tarbell married Mary Nurse, daughter of Rebecca Nurse. John Tarbell tried to save Rebecca by testifying on her behalf at her trial. The first 3 women to be accused of witchcraft in 1692 were easy targets for a witch hunt. Tituba, the slave, Sarah Good, the beggar, Sarah Osborne, an invalid who scandalized the neighbors by living with a former indentured servant. However, the next to be accused was shocking. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old devout, God-fearing woman who had raised 8 children to adulthood, all of whom lived by. She was a selfless nurturer, a devout farm wife, a loving mother who took in foster children on top of raising her own 8 children. Of all the charges, she might have been the most undeserving. Yet she was not only forced from her sickbed to answer charges of witchcraft, but strip-searched, excommunicated, and finally hanged through 39 of her neighbors, friends, and fellow church members signed a petition in her defense. Born in England in 1621, Rebecca Town immigrated as a young girl to Massachusetts with her family. The Towns built a modest farm in Topfield, just north of Salem, and in 1644 she married Francis Nurse, a member of the Salem Village Committee appointed to investigate Reverend Samuel Parris. Though they lived closer to Salem, Rebecca opted to become a member of the struggling Salem Village Church, even though her husband and father had a history of boundary disputes with the Putnams who attended. She was ill and hard of hearing. According to court testimony, Rebecca told visitors that she had heard about the girls' afflictions and regretted that she wasn't well enough to visit them, but had prayed for them. Then, in early March of 1692, 12-year-old Ann Putnam Jr. saw Rebecca's apparition, and the most devout and good-hearted woman became the 6th charged in the witchcraft trials. A warrant was issued on March 23rd by Judges John Hawthorne and Jonathan Corbin for the arrest of Rebecca Nurse. In a warrant were complaints of attacks on Ann Putnam Sr., Ann Putnam Jr., and Abigail Williams. Informed that her name had been linked to witchcraft, she wondered aloud, what sin could I have committed that God should lay such an affliction on me in my old age? She was dragged from the courthouse to be questioned. Too weary to confront her accusers, Rebecca Nurse simply told the truth. She was innocent as a child unborn. Called before the magistrates to hear Ann Putnam Jr.'s hateful charges, she stood unsteadily before the packed meeting house, saying only, "Oh, Lord, help me." The girls mimicked her gestures in demonstrating of her alleged sorcery. Instead of scolding them, Rebecca simply expressed bafflement and despair. The usual band of accusers went through their now familiar physical torment to prove Rebecca's guilt. A group of local goodwives stripped and searched Rebecca, uncovering a supernatural mark on her body. Try as she might to explain that it was a birth-related scar, her explanation was ignored. At the end of her trial in June of 1692, Nurse was found not guilty by the jury. The verdict was not surprising, as Nurse was well-liked in Salem, and 39 people had risked their lives to sign a petition to support her. But the afflicted girls made such a hue and cry that the judges called Rebecca back for further questioning. Asked if she worked in league with others accused of witchcraft, Rebecca had referred to the women in her testimony as one of my company. Asked to explain what she meant by the remark, Rebecca merely gazed at the judges with a confused look. Later it came to light that, being hard of hearing, she had not heard the question. But the judges interpreted her silence as an admission of guilt and sentenced her to death. Her supporters pressed for release, going so far as to persuade Governor John Phipps to order a reprieve. But again, the afflicted girls tried foul, and Governor Phipps backed down. Rebecca was hanged on July 19th, and her body was heaved into a shallow grave. The enduring legend maintains that her family stole her body away under cover of darkness and buried her in the farm, in a spot today marked by a fine headstone. On December 17th of 1711, the General Court awarded Nurse family a £25 restitution for the wrongful death and conviction of Rebecca. In 1909, Rebecca Nurse's home in Danvers, Massachusetts, formerly Salem Village, was purchased by the Rebecca Nurse Memorial Association and opened to the public as a historic house museum. The Rebecca Nurse homestead sits on 25 acres of the original 300 acres occupied by Rebecca Nurse's family from 1678 to 1698. The property holds the traditional salt box home lived in by the Nurse family. It's the only home of a person executed during the witch trials still standing and open to the public. Another unique feature is a reproduction of the 1772 Salem Witch Meeting House, where many of the early hearings surrounding the Salem Witch Trials took place. Giles and Martha Corey were the most famous Salem witches. Giles is our ancestor. Giles Corey married Martha on April 27, 1690. Martha was convicted of witchcraft and hanged. Giles was tortured to death for refusing to testify at Martha's trial. The two references below provide detailed accounts of both Giles and Martha's stories. This tree shows how we are related to Giles Corey II. Sixth great-grandfather Thomas Corey's tree is shown at the top of the chart. Thomas Corey was born in Harpole, England in 1622 and settled in Chelmsford, Massachusetts around 1650. 11th great-granduncle Giles Corey is shown in the bottom chart. Giles was born in Harpole, England in 1621 and settled in Salem in the early 1640s and became a prosperous farmer with 150 acres. Harpole was a very small town, so Thomas and Giles must have known each other in England. Thomas and Giles' common ancestor was Nicholas Corey, 11th great-grandfather Nicholas Corey, and 11th great-grandmother Emma Dunkey. Giles and Thomas were fifth cousins, one time removed. This drawing is of 65-year-old Martha Corey being questioned by Judge John Hawthorne and Ann Putnam Jr. sitting in the chair next to her having a fit. I'll talk more about Judge Hawthorne later. Martha Corey, wife of Salem village farmer Giles Corey, was accused of witchcraft during the Salem Witch Trials. Martha Corey, whose maiden name was Pandon, had a controversial past. In 1677, she gave birth to a mixed-race son out of wedlock. Martha married Giles Corey on April 27, 1690. Giles Corey was a wealthy farmer who had a troubled past himself ever since standing trial for murdering one of his farmhands in 1670. When the Salem Witch Trials began in the spring of 1692, Martha and Giles were some of the first people to attend the trials. But Martha soon expressed her doubts about the legitimacy of the claims and quit attending. When Giles tried to attend another trial, Martha hid Giles' saddle so he couldn't ride his horse to the trial. This apparently made her look suspicious to others, as if she were working with the witches to stop or impede the trials. Also, Giles had a boundary dispute with the Putnams, whose farm was nearby. Shortly after this dispute, Ann Putnam Jr. claimed Martha Corey's specter had attacked her. No one came to Martha Corey's defense, and other afflicted girls joined in, accusing Martha of bewitching them. Martha kept a brave face through all of this, even after a warrant was issued for her arrest on Saturday, March 19, 1692. Fortunately for Martha, the warrant was issued on late Saturday afternoon, and there wasn't enough time left in the day to arrest her. It was illegal to serve warrants on Sunday. Therefore, Martha was free until Monday, and she decided to take advantage of this opportunity. On Sunday, the townsfolk gawked in disbelief as they entered the meeting house church and saw Martha Corey, the reputed witch, sitting among the pious. Martha was still a de facto member of the church and fully entitled to all the privileges as long as the arrest warrant went unserved. The following day, Martha Corey was arrested and brought to Salem Village Meeting House to be examined by Judge Hawthorne. Judge Hawthorne badgered Martha throughout the examination and accused her of lying to the court multiple times. Judge Hawthorne then urged Martha to find God's mercy and confess, but of course she refused. He had asked her why she hid Giles Corey's saddle when he tried to attend the previous examination. Several other questions Hawthorne asked included, did she believe that there were witches in the colony? Who was her God? And how long had she been serving the devil? Martha laughed at all these questions and continued to deny any wrongdoing, stating, I am an innocent person. I've never had anything to do with witchcraft since I was born. I'm a gospel woman. The afflicted girls contributed to the chaos of Martha's examination by having fits every time Martha moved or turned her head. Giles Corey refused to give his wife to help his wife by corroborating his testimony against Martha on March 24th. From his actions, it appeared that Giles, who was reportedly swept up in the mass hysteria, believed the accusations against his wife. But when Giles himself was accused of witchcraft and arrested in mid-April, he quit cooperating with the court. In the meantime, a handful of people provided testimony against Martha in April and May. Then, when the case went to trial, a summons was issued for more witnesses. The witnesses including Abigail Williams, Samuel Parris, and Thomas Putnam Jr. Most of the afflicted girl's testimony consisted of more stories of spectral visions of Martha pinching, choking, and biting them, and visions of a yellow bird nursing from the spot between Martha's fingers. At the end of the examination, Martha Corey was indicted on 2 counts of witchcraft. After the hearing all of the testimony and weighing the evidence, Martha Corey was found guilty on September 8, 1682, and sentenced to death. After her conviction on September 11, Martha Corey was excommunicated from the church by Samuel Parris. Parris visited Martha Corey in jail to tell her about the excommunication in person and asked Martha to pray with him, which she refused to do and instead called him a hypocrite. On September 22, 1692, Martha Corey was brought to the execution site at Proctor's Ledge in a cart, along with 6 other convicted witches. These were the last hangings of the Salem Witch Trials. Shortly after, the court banned spectral evidence, making most of the witchcraft accusations baseless, and the trials began to die down until they officially came to an end and when the last prisoner was released in May of 1693. Most immediately after the trials, residents of Salem Village began to feel guilty about what occurred and tried to correct their mistakes any way they could. On January 15, 1697, the colony led a day of prayer, fasting, knowing the day as an official day of humiliation in honor of the witch trial victims. The colony had been suffering from natural disasters, including fires and severe storms, since the trials ended, and feared they had angered God by putting innocent people to death, and hoped that the prayer day would please him. In December of 1702, the Salem Village Church congregation took a vote and decided to repeal Martha's excommunication. In October 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill clearing the names of most of the Salem witches. Giles and Martha Corey were named in the bill, and the family was awarded restitution for their deaths. Giles Corey was considered by many to be a violent man after he was charged with beating his farmhand Jacob Goodale to death with a stick in 1676 when he was caught stealing apples. The death forever tainted Corey's reputation in Salem and later came back to haunt him during the witch trials. He was found guilty in the murder trial but only required to pay a fine. Many locals, especially Thomas Putnam Jr., suspected Corey had bribed someone to win his freedom. Corey's new troubles officially began on Monday, March 24th, 1692, when Martha Corey was arrested and charged with witchcraft. During Giles Corey's examination at the Salem Village Meeting House, the court asked him about his previous testimony against his wife, but he refused to provide any incriminating evidence. Then, on April 18, 1692, an arrest warrant was issued for Giles after Ann Putnam Jr. and Abigail Williams and a couple of other women accused him of practicing witchcraft. During the court's examination at the Salem Village House on April 19th, Judge John Hawthorne and Judge Jonathan Corbin repeatedly accused him of lying and even tied his pants to prevent him from practicing witchcraft in the courtroom. After untying one of his hands, afflicted girls began having fits, according to Reverend Parris's records. In fact, Corey was so resistant to participating in the witch trials, his own trial never moved forward, and he was never convicted because he died while being tortured by Sheriff Corbin that September. The torture was a result of his refusal to testify at the trial. Although Corey pleaded not guilty when the case went to trial in September, he had taken advantage of a widely used legal tactic known as standing mute, when he was asked by the customary question, would he ever accept a trial by the jury? English law at the time ordered a prisoner who stood mute to be tortured to force the prisoner to talk. The exact torture procedure consisted of stripping the prisoner naked and laying him on the ground and placing a board with heavy weights on top of him. The weight was slowly increased over a course of several days until the prisoner yielded. The idea to torture Corey may have been inspired by a letter Thomas Putnam Jr. sent to the judge, reminding him of the murder that Corey had involved in years before. Knowing that he was probably to die anyway, if not in jail, then on the gallows, many historians believe Corey refused to continue with his trial because he was determined to avoid a conviction before his death, so his estate would pass down to his grown children instead of being claimed by local authorities. During his torture on September 18th, Giles Corey was excommunicated from the church. The church document argued that he was either guilty of witchcraft or suicide due to his choice
to endure lethal torture rather than enter a plea. Either way, he was considered a sinner and was cast out by the church, just as his wife had been a week earlier. After being tortured for days, Corey finally died on September 19, 1692. Due to the gruesome nature and the very public nature of Corey's protest, it is said that to have caused many Salem residents at the time to rethink the witch trials. Despite Corey's efforts to protect his assets after his death, Sheriff George Corbett attempted to extort the family's money by threatening to seize Corey's estates if they didn't pay him. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill clearing some of the names of the accused, which include Martha and Giles Corey, and paid restitution for their imprisonment and death. It has long been rumored that Corey placed a curse on Salem, and that the sheriff during his torture, shouting, "Damn you, I curse you and Salem," at the sheriff before he died. 4 years after Corey's death, Sheriff Corbin died suddenly of a heart attack at just age 30. Locals believe that Corey's ghost still haunts the area around the Howard Street Cemetery, as is now known, and that his ghost is often seen before and after terrible events in the town. One such occasion happened shortly before the Great Salem Fire of 1914, when witnesses saw a ghostly figure of an old man floating through the cemetery. The fire started near the areas of Gallows Hill and Proctor's Ledge, where the Corey's wife Martha and 18 others had been hanged for witchcraft before it spread and destroyed the town. Giles Corey of the Salem Farms is a play written in 1868 by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. I'll recite a poem from the play that summarizes his story pretty well. Giles Corey was a wizard strong, a stubborn witch was he, and fit he was to hang on high upon the lowest tree. So when before the magistrate for trial he did come, he would no true confession make, but was completely numb. Giles Corey, said the magistrate, what has thee here to plea to those who now secure thy soul of crime and horrid deed? Giles Corey said not a word, not a single word spoke he. Giles Corey said to the magistrate, we'll press it out of thee. They got them a heavy beam and laid it on his breast, and loaded it with heavy stones and hard upon him pressed. More weight, now cried the wretched man, more weight again, he cried, and he did no confession make, and wickedly he died. Eighth great-grandfather John Proctor Sr. comes out of the Corey side of our tree through second great-grandfather Aaron Corey's wife, Elizabeth Bennett, and her grandmother, Sarah Dodge. John's family had more ancestors who were accused of the Salem Witch Trials than any other family I've found. John Sr. was a founder of Witchpit, where he was a wealthy landowner. He moved to Salem Village in 1665 and opened a tavern. He died in 1678, and leaving a tavern, an estate of £1,228 to his children, which is equivalent to $276,300 today. This is the Proctor extended family tree. The boxes are color-coded as shown in the empty boxes at the top of the chart. John Proctor and Martha Harper are our eighth great-grandparents. Seventh great-grandmother Sarah Proctor was John Proctor's daughter, who married seventh great-grandfather John Dodge. John and Sarah were the parents of sixth great-grandparents Jonathan and Josiah Dodge. Seventh great-grandmother Sarah Proctor's brother, seventh great-granduncle John Proctor Jr. was convicted of witchcraft and hanged. His wife, Elizabeth Bassett, was convicted but not hanged because she was pregnant. Three of John Jr.'s children were accused but not convicted. William, the oldest child, was accused on May 28th by Ann Putnam and several others, and was arrested by Constable John Putnam. John's daughter Sarah was accused also of witchcraft in a complaint by Thomas Proctor Jr. and John Putnam, Abigail Williams, and Ann Putnam, among others. Benjamin Proctor was accused of the same complaint. Benjamin married our sixth great-grandaunt Sarah Buckley, daughter of seventh great-grandfather William Buckley and Sarah Smith. Sixth great-grandaunt Mary Buckley and her mother, seventh great-grandmother Sarah Smith, were accused. Seventh great-aunt Elizabeth Bassett had a son, John Proctor, while in prison. Sarah Smith, John Buckley, and William Proctor were not convicted. Mary Buckley's sister, sixth great-grandmother Sarah Buckley, was not arrested. None of these pedigree ancestors were accused of witchcraft. I'll show from the chart of this interconnection from all of our ancestors, and I'll have more to say about them below. Seventh great-granduncle John Proctor II was born in 1631 in Suffolk, England, and came to Ipswich, Massachusetts with his parents, eighth grandparents John Proctor and Mary Harper, in 1693. In 1666, he moved with his family to Salem and managed his 700-acre farm there. In 1668, he obtained a license to operate a tavern that he named the Proctor Inn, which his sister ran. The new business, which was located on Ipswich Road about half a mile south of Salem village boundary, became very lucrative for the Proctors and made him very wealthy. He married his third wife, Elizabeth Bassett, who was 20 years younger, in 1676, and she helped to run the tavern. He became one of the wealthiest property owners in the area, and was envied by his neighbors. He was a large, loud, forceful man with great energy, and one of the very few people throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony to stand up against the charges of witchcraft. In 1692, 60-year-old John Proctor II denounced the whole witchcraft hysteria and declared the affected young girls a scam. When his pregnant wife Elizabeth was hauled off to the court and accused of being a witch, he came uninvited to her examination and stood up for her. He said that the afflicted girls were to be believed, we all would be devils and witches quickly. He recommended that the girls be whipped or even hanged. Abigail Williams properly accused John of being a witch, and the Proctor's servant, a refuge from the Indian attacks, Mary Warren, sided with Abigail. During his trial, Mary Warren, who was later accused of witchcraft herself when the other girls turned against her, testified that Proctor's spirit had beat her and forced her to touch the devil's book. Many of the affected girls, including Ann Petram Jr., Abigail Williams, testified that Proctor's spirit tortured and afflicted them during his examination in the court that day, and had continued to do so ever since. One of the court stenographers at the time, possibly Samuel Harris, wrote that during Abigail Williams' testimony, the afflicted girls continually cried out when they saw Proctor's spirit in various places in the court, and even claimed they saw him sitting in the judge's lap. Not only was John Proctor the first man to be arrested or accused of witchcraft, but his wife and his children all were accused. He had his trial on April 11, 1692, and was sentenced to jail on July 23rd. On July 23rd, Proctor wrote a letter to the clergy of Boston, pleading with them to appoint a different judge or move the trials to Boston, where he felt he would get a fairer trial. In his letter, he described the torture used against the prisoners, particularly against his son William. He declared that the accused were innocent victims. On August 1st, 8 Boston ministers met to discuss Proctor's letter and eventually changed their stance on allowing the use of spectral evidence in the trials. But it was too late to save John Proctor's life. Both John and Elizabeth were put in jail, and their children were tortured until they confessed that their parents were witches. This was the only time that any of our accused ancestors confessed to being witches. John wrote about the treatment of his 17-year-old son. My son William Proctor, when he was examined because he would not confess he was guilty when he was innocent, they tied him neck and heels until blood rushed from his nose. John Proctor and his wife both convicted of witchcraft on August 5th, 1692, and sentenced to death. Elizabeth's sentence was delayed until the birth of her child, but she was never hanged. John was hanged at Proctor's Ledge on August 19th, along with 4 others. While John and Elizabeth Proctor sat in jail, many of their friends came to the events and signed petitions asking for them to be released, but to no avail. John Proctor's son Benjamin was accused on May 23rd by Mary Warren, Abigail Williams, and others. The Massachusetts legislature passed a bill in 1711 restoring the names of some of the Salem Witch Trial victors. It cleared the Proctors of their witchcraft convictions and allowed the family to be awarded £150 restitution for John's death and the family's imprisonment. In Arthur Miller's play about the Salem Witch Trials, The Crucible, a romantic relationship between John Proctor and Abigail Williams is described, for which there is absolutely no evidence to support, but apparently made the story more interesting. It does seem very unlikely, since Abigail was 12 and John was 60 with a pregnant young wife. However, the story had taken on a life of its own, much like the fictional romance between Captain John Smith and 12-year-old Pocahontas of Jamestown popularized in the Disney movie. This structure, located at 348 Lowell Street, has long been called the John Proctor House. even though it is likely not the actual house where John and Elizabeth Proctor and their children lived. Rather, it is believed to be that John Proctor's son, Thorndike, built the house one sees today on the same footprint where his father's house had originally stood. There's a possibility that some of the original structure remains inside. John Proctor's descendants purchased the property and remained living there for close to 200 years after his execution. The picture on the left is Proctor's Ledge Memorial. The memorial is the base of Proctor's Ledge, which is the location where the executions took place during the Salem Witch Trials. The memorial is dedicated to the 19 people who were hanged during the Salem Witch Trials. The memorial consists of a semicircular granite wall with 19 stones engraved in the names and execution dates of the 19 victims. A small oak tree, which symbolizes endurance and dignity, marks the center of the memorial. The picture on the right shows the names of the 19 victims. Giles Corey's name does not appear because he was not hanged. He was tortured to death for refusing to testify against his wife. For many years, it was believed that the 19 innocent people who were executed in 1692 were hung on the summit of Gallows Hill at the edge of town. The exact site was not memorialized, after all, because this was a shameful event for the Salem residents and wanted to leave it in the past. Maps of 1700 Salem showed Gallows Hill, but no marker for the execution site. In 1921, local historian Sidney Purley believed he had located the spot the executions were held near the base of the hill on Proctor's Ledge. This conclusion led the city of Salem to purchase part of the Proctor's Ledge in 1636, calling it Witch Memorial Land. No memorial was built, however, until 2016. Most of the people still believe the executions took place at the summit. A team of researchers began to consider all the evidence in 2010 and eventually concluded that Purley was right. The real execution spot was confirmed at the Proctor's Ledge in January of 2016. Part of the evidence included the 1692 witness accounts of nearby neighbors who were able to see the hanging from their homes. Elizabeth Proctor, whose name and name was Bassett, was the granddaughter of Quaker Goody Burt, a folk healer from Lynn who had been tried but acquitted on charges of witchcraft over 30 years earlier. Elizabeth was not a doctor, but like her grandmother, a folk healer who was successful at curing the sick using herbal potions. Some people felt that they could only have medical skills if they were witches. Puritans in general felt there was something witch-like about Quakers, and because Elizabeth's family, who were Quakers, this would make her suspect. In late March, two of the afflicted girls, Mary Lewis and Abigail Williams, claimed Elizabeth Proctor visited them at night in spirit form and tormented them. On April 4th, John Walcott and Nathaniel Ingersoll filed an official complaint against Elizabeth Proctor on behalf of Abigail Williams and Proctor Jr. and others. A warrant was issued for her arrest. Elizabeth also refused to confess. On April 5th, both Elizabeth and John were found guilty and sentenced to death. Since Elizabeth was pregnant at the time of her conviction, her execution was postponed until she gave birth. In January 1693, while still in jail, Elizabeth Proctor gave birth to a son, John Proctor III. Elizabeth and John Proctor III remained in jail until May, when the governor, William Phillips, ordered the general release, freeing all of the prisoners who remained in jail. At this time, families were required to pay their family members' room and board while in jail, as well as the cost of John's execution. Though she was finally free, her torments were far from over. She had no home to return to. All her possessions had been seized after they were convicted. Further, her husband John had left her out of the will because he thought she would hang along with him. Adding to the turmoil was the fact that she had been convicted, which not only made her a pariah for the locals, but in the eyes of the law, she was considered a dead woman and could not claim any of her husband's estate. She, her children, and stepchildren were impoverished. She and her children then lived with a stepson, Benjamin Proctor, who was in his father's will. Elizabeth petitioned the court for a reversal of retainer to restore her legal rights. According to court records, on April 19, 1697, the court restored Elizabeth's legal rights and returned her dowry to her. Not much is known about Elizabeth after this time period, except that on September 22, 1699, she married her second husband, Daniel Richards, in Lynn, Massachusetts. There are no records of her death or no records of her younger children's in Ling, indicating the family probably moved on to another town. Her death and location of her grave are unknown. Seventh great-grandmother Sarah Smith was born in Norfolk, England in 1637. She, along with seventh great-grandfather Daniel Andrews, were our only two pedigree ancestors accused of witchcraft. She married seventh great-grandfather William Buckley, a shoemaker, in 1657 in Ipswich, Massachusetts. They had two daughters, sixth great-grandmother Sarah and seventh great-aunt Mary, as well as 6 other children. They were prosperous at first, but their property was seized when they lost a lawsuit brought against them by Governor Simon Bradstreet in 1675. William was sued by the governor for debts and lost his house and lands in Ipswich. In 1680, they moved to Salem, where he was sued again for debts incurred by his son and lost the cobbler tools, which left him destitute and without any means of making a living. They were very poor but respected in the community. In May of 1692, Sarah and her widowed daughter, sixth great-aunt Mary, were accused of witchcraft and arrested. Both women were examined on May 18th, accused by Ann Putnam Jr., who said Sarah's specter had tortured them. Sarah's husband, William Buckley, was able to convince 2 pastors to speak in favor of them, but it would not be enough. Both were sent to prison. Sarah Buckley and Mary Buckley Ridrich were held in shackles for 8 months in a cold, crowded jail with all the horrors and deprivations of the accused. Although they were acquitted, they had to pay the expenses for their imprisonment, leaving the family desperately impoverished. Their few remaining possessions had all been seized by the sheriff. Before long, the family was homeless and begging for subsistence. 80-year-old William Buckley died starving and homeless on January 2nd, 1702. Seventh great-grandmother Sarah died in 1720, but little is known about where she went after William died. Sixth great-aunt Mary Buckley later married Benjamin Proctor, who was accused of witchcraft himself. None of them were convicted. However, Mary and Benjamin raised 4 children in Salem after the witch trials. I talked about the Perkins family in Chapter 5. Eighth great-grandfather John Perkins and Judith Gaynor arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in early 1631 with their daughter, seventh great-aunt Mary. Seventh great-grandmother Lydia Perkins was born in Ipswich in 1632, and she was Mary's sister. Seventh great-aunt Mary Perkins of Ipswich married Thomas Bradbury in 1636 and moved to Salisbury. By 1692, Captain Thomas Bradbury, one of the first colonial settlers in Salisbury, was arguably the most prominent citizen and respected by all. 77-year-old Mary Perkins Bradbury, too, was a beloved member of the community. She had been noted throughout life for business capacity, energy, influence, and by 1692 was somewhat infirmed. George Carr was the father of Anne Carr Putnam, the wife of Thomas Putnam Jr., and of her brothers James, John, and William Carr. It has been speculated that the tribal wars between the Carrs and the Bradburys were sparked when Mary Perkins passed over an offer of marriage from George Carr and married Thomas Bradbury instead. John and James Carr both claimed that Mary had bewitched them when they tried to court Mary's daughters. Perhaps the most important Carr targeting Mary Bradbury was Anne Carr Putnam Sr., who accused Mary of bewitching her brothers. All but one of the depositions against Mary were recorded in handwriting by Thomas Putnam Sr., Anne's husband. A petition signed by 115 supporters did nothing to change the judge's mind. She was convicted and sentenced to death in September the 10th. However, with the help of many of her friends and her wealth, she escaped from jail and lived as a fugitive outside of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. She remained in hiding until 1693 and finally returned to her family in that year. She died in Salisbury in 1700 at the age of 85. In September 1710, Mary Bradbury's daughter Jane and Jane's husband Henry True petitioned the court for reversal of Bradbury's conviction and restitution of cost. On October 17, 1711, the act to reverse the attainders of George Burroughs and others for witchcraft was passed on the Massachusetts General Court. Among those cleared was Mary Bradbury. The family received £20 of restitution. Some notable descendants of John and Mary Perkins Bradbury include Ralph Waldo Emerson and astronaut Alan Shepard. Notable descendants of John and Judah Gaynor Perkins of Ipswich include Franklin Roosevelt, Calvin Coolidge, Mildred Fillmore, Lucille Ball, Montgomery Clift, Anthony Perkins, and Tennessee Williams. The General Court of Massachusetts Bay Colony had no power to meet between the time the 1629 charter was revoked in 1686 and the new charter was put in place in late 1692. In June of 1692, a special court of oyer to hear and terminer to decide was created in Salem to hear the witch trial cases. The courts consisted of Justice William Staunton plus 8 successful merchants, landowners, and politicians of the day. They were Jonathan Corwin, Bartholomew Getty, John Hathorne, John Richards, Nathaniel Soursall, Peter Sargent, Samuel Sewell, and Waite Winthrop. We'll hear more about Judge John Hathorne below. The special court recognized spectral evidence despite that it was not in keeping with the general accepted court procedures of the time. Judge John Hathorne was best known as the witch judge, as he was the magistrate and the chief interrogator of the special court of oyer and terminer established to try the accused witches. His father, William, was a local judge who came to the New World on the Arabelle, one of John Winthrop's 11 ships that brought 1,000 Puritans to the colony in the summer of 1630. John was known for being a bitter prosecutor of Quakers before coming to Salem. Hawthorne's first examination took place on March 1st when he questioned Sarah Osborne, Tituba, and Sarah Good in the Salem Village Meeting House. During the examination of Martha Corey, Hawthorne repeatedly badgered and outright accused her of lying, according to court records. His interrogations were so prejudiced against the accused that the bewitched girls came to rely on his backing. Suspects were assumed guilty. But Hawthorne could not shame them into confessing and naming collaborators. He would trick them. And he had no qualms about intimidating their young children into confessions. He often began examinations by asking accusing children who had hurt them and showing great pity for their condition. Hawthorne haste in conviction and determining detainees and his refusal to consider a verdict even after major witnesses has recanted their testimony has left historians wondering if he was profiting materially from the victim's demise. Hawthorne might have stood to have some financial gain from the trials from the seizure of property that took place during the trials. The belongings of convicted witches were routinely seized, ostensibly to pay for their jail expenses. They were also served retainers which stripped them of their rights, including rights to own property or bequeath land. Whatever his motives, Hawthorne displayed little remorse for sending 19 people to the gallows, nor did his career seem to suffer. After the Salem Witch Trials ended, even though many participants in the trials regretted their actions and made public apologies, Hawthorne refused and showed no remorse. In fact, in 1702, he was appointed to the Superior Court. He died in Salem 5 years later at the age of 76 and was interred in Salem's Charter Street burial ground. John Hawthorne was the great-great-grandfather of author Nathaniel Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne was troubled by being a descendant of Judge Hawthorne. He substituted the W for the T in the spelling of his name to disassociate himself from the Judge Hawthorne. Nathaniel Hawthorne felt that Justice Hawthorne played a wicked part in the witch trials. Supposedly, one of the victims condemned to die as a witch cursed the judge and his descendants. The family curse was a major plot in the House of Seven Gables, and Judge Hawthorne appeared as the antagonist, Judge Pentheon, in Hawthorne's 1851 novel. Hawthorne also mentioned the curse in the preface of the Scarlet Letter, which was a harsh critique of the Massachusetts Puritans. Nathaniel Hawthorne apologized for his ancestors' callousness. I know not whether the ancestors of mine betrothed themselves to repent and ask for pardon in heaven for these cruelties, he wrote in the introduction to his novel, The Scarlet Letter, or whether they are now groaning under the heavy consequences of them in another state of being. In a strange twist, a number of John Hawthorne's descendants married descendants of the accused John Proctor. John Proctor's third great-grandson, Thorndike Proctor, married John Hawthorne's second great-granddaughter, Elizabeth Hawthorne, a cousin to Nathaniel Hawthorne. This tree shows the relationship between the Hawthornes, the Putnams, and the Porters. The yellow boxes will show our pedigree ancestors. Remember, the seventh great-grandfather, Daniel Andrews, was convicted of witchcraft but escaped. The magenta line traces the Hawthornes from William to Judge John Hawthorne and his sisters Anne and Elizabeth. The blue lines trace the Putnams from John Putnam Sr. to John Putnam Jr. and his wife Ann Carr and their daughter Ann Putnam Jr. and his half-brother Joseph. The red lines trace the Porters from John Porter to Joseph, Israel, Sarah, and Elizabeth Porter. You can see that the seventh great-granduncle Joseph Porter married Anne Hawthorne, sister of Judge Hawthorne. Israel Porter, brother of seventh great-grandmother Sarah Porter, married Elizabeth Hawthorne, sister of Judge Hawthorne. Judge Hawthorne obviously had several conflicts of interest and in a normal trial would have had to recuse himself. Probably the most interesting marriage was between Joseph Putnam, son of Thomas Putnam Jr., and Elizabeth Porter, daughter of eighth great-grandfather John Porter, considering the family rivalries. Unlike his brother, Joseph Putnam was an early and outspoken opponent of the witchcraft. The examination began, he stormed over to Thomas Putnam's house and confronted Ann Putnam Jr. "If you dare to touch with your foul lies anyone belonging to my household," he told her, "you shall answer for it." For months, Joseph kept horses saddled and armed with his family to guarantee their escape if they were accused. They never were. Thomas Putnam, his wife Ann Putnam Sr., and their daughter Ann Putnam Jr. were the chief accusers in the witch trials. This tree shows how our seventh great-granduncle John Tarbell is related to Rebecca Nurse. Our pedigree ancestors are in the yellow boxes. Seventh great-granduncle John Tarbell was the son of our eighth great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell III and Anna Longley. He married Mary Nurse's daughter of Francis and Rebecca Nurse. So Rebecca Nurse, who was hanged for witchcraft, was John's mother-in-law. He testified at Rebecca's trial, but to no avail. After the trials were stopped, John Tarbell served on the church committee that voted to fire Reverend Samuel Parris in 1690. Seventh great-grandfather Peter Woodbury was the son of eighth great-grandfather John Woodbury, one of the founders of Salem. Peter married seventh great-grandmother Sarah Dodge, daughter of eighth great-grandparents Richard and Edith Dodge. He was appalled by the witch trials. He aided the accused to escape to New Hampshire, which was outside of the jurisdiction of the court. He kept horses saddled in the barn so that the accused could escape. This is a picture of the reconstructed First Salem Village Meeting House. The First Salem Village Meeting House was the scene of the examinations of several of our accused ancestors. The first three to be accused, Tituba, Sarah Osborne, and Sarah Good, were put on trial here in March 1st, 1692. The initial examinations were originally scheduled to take place in Ingersoll's Tavern down the road, but so many people turned up to witness the initial examinations that they had to relocate to the proceedings to the larger meeting house. Also examined here were Rebecca Nurse and Martha and Giles Corey. George Hawthorne was the chief interrogator at the Salem Witch Trials. This table shows our 16 ancestors who were involved in the Salem Witch Trials. 3 were executed, 1 was tortured to death, 3 were convicted but not executed, 5 were acquitted, 1 was born in prison, 1 testified at the trial of Rebecca Nurse, 1 went against his family and defended the accused and helped others to escape. 1 helped the accused to escape. None of our pedigree ancestors were executed. 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews was convicted but escaped, and 7th great-grandmother Sarah Smith was acquitted. This map shows where the people I have discussed lived in Salem Village during the witch trials. This is the index to the map on the previous chart. The causes of the Salem witch trials continue to be a subject of interest. Various medical and psychological explanations for the observed symptoms have been explored by researchers, including psychological hysteria in response to the Indian attacks, convulsive egotism caused by eating rye bread made from grain infected by a fungus from which LFD is derived, an epidemic of bird-borne encephalitis. I'm of the opinion that the Salem Witch Trials were the result of a perfect storm of events that came together in Salem Village in 1692. The Puritans' strong belief in the devil and witches, a fundamentalist preacher and local doctor in Salem Village who handled the situation with the young girls just the opposite way that Reverend Samuel Willard and the local doctors in Groton did with Elizabeth Knapp 20 years earlier. A group of young servant girls who were traumatized by Indian attacks during the King William War and got no emotional support from their Puritan masters. An exotic Caribbean slave who was the only person the young girls had to turn to for comfort. The political uncertainty in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1692 that totally disrupted the judicial system in the colony when it was desperately needed to function well. The corrupt judges like Judge Hathorne, who allowed spectral evidence, forbade the accused from having legal counsel, and profited from the trials. The Putnam family, taking advantage of the hysteria of the witch craze to punish their rival families they had long-running feuds with by accusing them of witchcraft and turning the trials into something more like an inquisition. An exceptionally cold and brutal winter caused by shortages and depression of the citizens in the Salem Village. As we saw that in Europe, where the timing of the witch trials correlated with the political and religious instability there, the multiple instabilities in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1692 created the same climate in Salem. I think the overarching cause goes back to the situation I discussed in Chapter 6, the generation gap between the original Puritan immigrants and the new generation who were born in America. The original Puritans thought they were building a new society based on the Bible and that if everyone followed their strict rules, it would be utopian. By 1692, the next generation had taken over. The utopian society had never materialized as promised by their parents, and they were disillusioned. The Puritan power was waning, the Indian attacks were attacking, their village was in disarray, God was unhappy with them, and they needed to find culprits responsible, and witches were among them were the convenient answer. Most people believe that the persecution of witches reached its height in early 1690 with the trials in Salem. But the grim paradox of the 21st century life is that violence against people accused of witchcraft is very much still with us. Witch hunts are practiced today throughout the world. While it is an unknown problem in parts of Western populations of the world, body counts of modern witch hunts far exceed those of the 17th century. Far from fading away, witch hunting has become a growing global problem. In recent years, there have been a spate of attacks against people accused of witchcraft in Africa, the Pacific, and Latin America, and even among immigrant communities in the United States and Western Europe. Researchers in the United Nations Refuge and Human Rights Agency have estimated murders of supposed witches as numbering in the thousands each year. Saudi Arabia reported 118 arrests for practicing witchcraft in 2009. Two references below give information about how about people are being procured by witches today around the world. It appears to be a perpetual human problem. Whatever happened to Reverend Samuel Parris and his family and Tituba? Quote from Samuel Parris, "I am not some preaching farmer with a book under my arm. I am a graduate of Harvard College." Kinds of sums up his opinion of himself. By the way, although he did attend Harvard, there is no record that he ever graduated from Harvard. Much of what known is about the proceedings of the trial come from Reverend Parris' longhand notes. Later, most of the Parris records were mysteriously disappeared. When the crisis blew over, his slave Tituba was still in prison, but Parris refused to pay the fees to enable her release. Instead, she was sold to an unknown slave trader. The trial ended. After the trial ended, Reverend Parris preached every Sunday as before, but the church attendance continued to dwindle. His congregation had not forgotten the sermons that he had delivered in the spring of 1692, calling for swift convictions. His opponents, including several of our ancestors, would form a solid faction and campaign for his dismissal. They had long stopped paying his share of the salary and became more vocal in their opposition to his ownership of the parsonage. In 1695, a group of Massachusetts clergymen convened in Salem to sort out the conflict, but to no avail. The beleaguered pastor hung onto his pulpit, probably fearing of finding another appointment elsewhere. He scolded his congregation for lies they spread about him and even threatened litigation. He never apologized or even acknowledged his role in fueling the witch hunt. Reverend Samuel Parris was fired in 1697 and replaced by Reverend Thomas Green, who reversed Martha Corey's excommunication and spent the rest of his life trying to restore the reputation of Salem Village. Reverend Parris refused to vacate the parsonage until he had collected his back pay and accepted a preaching position in Stowe. He moved 3 times, first to Concord, then to Dunstable, and finally to Sudbury, where he died in 1720 at the age of 67. As it happened, his daughter Betty would fare much better in life than her afflicted friends. She married and settled in Concord, Massachusetts, where she raised 5 children and lived to be 78. Parris's son Knowles, on the other hand, died insane. Ann Putnam Jr., along with Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams, were the main accusers during the Salem Witch Trials. Of the people Abigail Williams accused and or testified against, 15 were executed, 1 was tortured to death, others either died in jail, were pardoned, were found not guilty, escaped, or even evaded arrest altogether. Neither Abigail Williams nor Betty Parris ever apologized for their roles in the Salem Witch Trials. Although Betty Parris married and later raised a family in Sudbury, there were no records indicating whatever happened to Abigail Williams after the witch trials ended. Ann Putnam Jr., the 12-year-old daughter of Thomas Putnam and his wife Ann Carr Putnam, became one of the most prolific accusers of the trial, naming and testifying against more than 48 people. Ann Putnam Jr. was the only afflicted girl who apologized when she submitted a written apology to the Church of Salem Village in 1706. Ann Putnam Jr. died unmarried at the age of 35. Ann Sr. and Thomas Putnam died heavily in debt within 2 weeks of each other in 1699, leaving Ann Jr. to care for the 9 younger siblings. In adulthood, Ann Jr. would seek forgiveness for her role in the witch hunts. While joining the Salem Church in 1706, Ann stood quietly before the congregation as Reverend Parris's accuser. Reverend John Joseph Green recited a solemn statement acknowledging her guilt and expressed her wishes to be humble before God. It has been a great delusion of Satan that deceived her in this sad time, the statement said. She had acted ignorantly, yes, but without anger, malice, or poor will for any person, and wished only to lie in the dust for the wrong she had done to Elizabeth Nurse and her 2 sisters. That wish would be granted. 9 years later, Ann Putnam Jr. died unmarried at the age of 35. Well, whatever happened to the Puritans? After King William issued the new charter for the province of Massachusetts in 1691, the Puritans lost their stranglehold on the Massachusetts colonial government. After the witch trials, the Puritans' extreme beliefs were discredited and replaced by more liberal Protestant domination beliefs. The fact that confessioned witches were not severely punished and those who claimed their innocence were hanged made people wonder about the legitimacy of Puritan confessions. After 1692 witch trials ended, spectral evidence was not allowed in the court, and afterwards no one was ever executed in North America for being a witch. Although there were many times more Puritans than Pilgrims, the Pilgrims became the favorite religion in America's founding mythology. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a general amnesty and exonerated all but 6 of those accused of being witches, and made restitution to their families of those who were jailed. In 2001, the Massachusetts governor signed a bill that's cleared all witches hanged during the Salem Witch Trials. During periods of national crisis and stress, particularly during the Red Scare after the Russian Revolution and in the early 1950s during the Cold War, the government initiated prosecutions and Congress conducted investigation of communists and other outsiders that have sometimes been likened to witch hunts. The Salem Witch Trials were subject of Arthur Miller's The Crucible, written in the 50s. Many read Miller's play as a criticism of McCarthyism, the Red Square, and intolerance. The Crucible itself met with censorship in some communities and has been banned from some schools. Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote his best-selling book criticizing the Puritans. Today, the Puritans are best known for witch hunts, narrow-mindedness, and intolerance. Over half of the immigrant ancestors I have found settled in Massachusetts Bay Colony, and most of those arrived in the 1630s. So we definitely have a lot of Puritan ancestors. However, over the last 3 chapters, I've introduced several of those ancestors who pushed back against their extreme Puritan beliefs. During the Salem Witch Trials, 7th great-granduncle John Proctor was executed for standing up to the accusers. 7th great-grandfather Daniel Andrews was convicted for serving on a committee questioning Reverend Parris. 9th great-grandfather Nathaniel Biscoe was not a member of the church, but objected to paying taxes to support the Puritan ministers. In 1642, he wrote a privately circulated pamphlet against the ways of supporting ministers that gave great offense when it was made public, for which he was fined £10. He was so dissatisfied with the prevailing religious intolerance that he returned to England, where he died in 1652. 9th great-grandfather William Knapp was fined numerous times for speaking against the government and selling beer without a license. 10th great-grandfather Thomas Hooker was so disgusted with the intolerance of the Massachusetts Puritans that he moved his congregation to Connecticut. 8th great-grandfather Thomas Prescott refused to join the Puritan Church and was not allowed to vote until he was 65 years old, when King Charles II nullified the rule that you had to be a church member to vote. 2 of our ancestors were kidnapped by Indians and sold to French Canadians and became Catholic nuns. I do have one thing to say about the Puritans. They believed very strongly in education for everyone, including William. And our 6th great-grandmother, Abigail Good, was one of the first school teachers in Chelford, Massachusetts. This chart shows the evolution of Protestantism in the British American colonies. The roots of all Western Christianity is the Roman Catholic Church, as I discussed in Chapter 2. Martin Luther's Protestant Reformation led to the formation of the Lutheran Church in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, the Presbyterian Church in Scandinavia and Scotland, and the Anglican Church in England. Pilgrims, Puritans, and Quakers split off from the Anglican Church, and their followers immigrated to British American colonies. Pilgrims started the Plymouth colony, but eventually merged with the Puritans or became Baptists. The Puritans immigrated to New England colonies and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. When the followers of the Anglican Church came to Virginia colonies, they became Episcopalians, and when they came to the Georgia colony, they became Methodists. For reasons I've discussed here, by 1700, the Puritan Church was completely discredited and disbanded. Their followers eventually joined the churches shown at the bottom of the chart, or formed new denominational churches. However, many of the beliefs and attitudes of the Puritans are still alive in fundamentalist and evangelical Christian churches throughout the United States today. In the Salem Witch Trials in 1692, most citizens believed in witches, and that anyone who questioned them, like our 7th great-granduncle John Proctor, was accused of being a witch and hanged. Over 2,000 years ago, my favorite philosopher, Lao Tzu, said, "When everybody thinks something is good, it becomes bad. Or when everyone believes the same thing and the questions are not allowed, things tend to turn out bad." Things only go well when you allow opposing views about a solution to a problem and use the dialectic method to find the best solution. The dialectic method is a discussion between 2 or more people holding different points of view about a subject, but wishing to establish the truth through some reasoned arguments. Dialectic dialogue began with the Greek philosophers Plato and Socrates about 400 BC. Our democracy works best when this method is used in Congress, and when we have 2 opposing groups with approximately the same power that must compromise to pass new laws. Today we have one side that is using false information and voter suppression to gain enough power to keep the other side from having any say in what's happening. Donald Trump, Steve Bannon, and their followers tried to create the same type of hysteria that was caused during the Salem Witch Trials, which led to the January 6th insurrection. Fortunately, there are still people around today questioning them. I have one more thing to talk about before ending this chapter, and that is the French Indian Wars. I discussed the King William War, known as the War of Grand Alliance in Europe, earlier in the chapter, and how it affected the young girls who were initial accusers in the Salem Witch Trials. Now I'm going to talk about how the King William War and the Queen Anne War affected our ancestors after the Salem Witch Trials. These ancestors lived in Groton and were attacked by Indians both in the King William War and the Queen Anne Wars. Since there was a 30-year gap between the Queen Anne War and the King George War, I'll only talk about the first 2 wars in this chapter. In Chapter 6, I talked about our ancestors who lived in Groton. This tree shows those pedigree ancestors who were attacked in Groton during the King William War and the Queen Anne Wars. There were a lot of intermarriages among these families, as you shall see. They all come out of a second great-grandfather, Aaron Corey's branch of the tree, through his mother, Mary Green. The red boxes show the Benjamin Crisp and his family. The green boxes show the Tarbell and Longley families, and the blue boxes show the Blood and the Parker families. I'll discuss how these families were affected by the Indian attacks below. During the King William War, the French paid Indians for English scalps and for kidnapped English children. Indian fighters did a brisk business in trade for these captives. They also sold kidnapped children to the French families in Canada. Some captives were ransomed back to families or communities. Others were adopted by Indian families as replacements for their children who were killed during the war. Some 40 warriors traveled to Groton, Massachusetts, where they raided on the morning of July 27, 1694. They killed some 20 people and took 13 others captive. 7 members of the Longley family were killed and 3 were kidnapped. This tree shows the families of 8th great-grandfather Benjamin Crisp and 8th great-grandfather William Longley, who had members of their families killed or kidnapped during the King William War. The yellow boxes show our pedigree ancestors, and the green boxes show our non-pedigree ancestors. 8th great-grandfather Benjamin Crisp's wife, 8th great-grandmother Mary Bridget, was killed during the King Philip War, which we discussed in Chapter 6. William Longley Jr., son of 8th great-grandfather William Longley Sr., and Dolores Crisp, daughter of Benjamin Crisp, were killed. All their children were attacked. William and Dolores' children, Zachariah, William, Joseph, Nathaniel, and Betty, were killed. Lydia, John, and Elizabeth were kidnapped. Elizabeth died shortly after being kidnapped. Jemina was scalped but survived. I'll discuss the kidnapped Shirley below. Note the pedigree ancestors, 7th great-grandmother Mary Crisp, sister of Dolores Crisp, and 7th great-grandmother Hannah Longley, sister of William Longley, were not harmed during the attack. Lydia Longley was born into the Puritan Longley family of Groton, Massachusetts in 1674. She was the granddaughter of 8th great-grandfather Benjamin Crisp and 8th great-grandmother Mary Bridget. In 1694, when she was 20 years old, she was kidnapped by the Abenaki Indians. She was sold to Jacques Labar, a wealthy Frenchman who lived in Montreal. She lived in the Labar household for 2 years and was well cared for by them. In 1696, she was baptized into the Catholic faith and given the name Lydia Mandeline. In 1699, she took her vows as Sister Mandeline in the Congregation of Notre Dame, becoming the first woman of American birth to become a Catholic nun. That year, she entered the Congregation of Notre Dame. Sister Lydia Mandeline spent most of her career in Montreal, but later served as superior at the mission of Sainte Famille de la Laurence near the city of Quebec. On July 21, 1758, she died at the age of 85 and was buried in the chapel of Infant Jesus in Montreal. Her Puritan parents would have been horrified to know that she became a Catholic after they had immigrated to the colonies to get away from Anglicans and Catholics. In the mid-20th century, she became known as the first American nun after a popular children's book, Lydia Longley, the First American Nun, was published in 1958. John Longley, grandson of 8th great-grandfather William Longley, was born in Groton in 1680. In 1694, he was kidnapped along with his sister Lydia by Abenaki Indians and taken to Canada when he was 12 years old. He became an Indian servant and adopted to Indian life. In 1699, when he was 17, he was released as a prisoner exchange and returned to Groton. Even though most of his family was killed during the raid, he readopted to colonial life, married Sarah Prescott, sister of 6th great-grandmother Elizabeth Prescott and daughter of 7th great-grandfather Jonas Prescott. We talked about 8th great-grandfather Captain James Parker and the King Philip War in Chapter 6. The tree shows how his family was affected by the attack on Groton during the King William War. The yellow boxes show our pedigree ancestors. The green boxes show our non-pedigree ancestors affected by the attacks. The blue boxes show the ancestors kidnapped by Indians, and the magenta boxes show those ancestors killed by Indians. As the war went on, Groton endured its share of small invasions and attacks, but here and there. But the most serious trouble was found Groton on July 27, 1694. A band of Indians gathered and attacked the outlying areas of the town at the break of dawn. They caught the townspeople unaware as they were just waking for a new day. When the raid was finished, the settlers ventured out of the garrisons and found 22 people killed. Mostly were adult men and women, and 13 children missing. The Indians took the captives to the river where they were able to quickly escape to Canada. The scalps of the victims were given to Major Frontenac in Montreal in exchange for bounty. Eighth great-grandfather James Parker's son, seventh great-grand-uncle James Parker, and his wife Mary were killed and scalped during the attack in front of their children. Mary Parker was the daughter of James Parker, James Parker's brother Abraham, making James Jr. and Mary first cousins. Their children, Samuel, Mary, and Phineas, were quickly captured and taken prisoner along with 10 other children. The Parker children would remain in captivity for 4 years. Phineas Parker returned permanently maimed in one leg when he was returned by his uncle Joshua Parker after he paid a ransom of £6. Note that our pedigree ancestors living in Groton at the time were not harmed during the attack. The War of Spanish Succession was a war between England, France, and Spain and Portugal to determine who would be the next king of Spain. In the colonies, it was called the Queen Anne War, or the Second French Indian War. It broke out in 1701 and was a primary conflict between French, Spanish, and English colonists for the control of the American continent, with each side allied mostly with the same Native Americans tribes that were aligned with in the King William War. However, the Mohawks joined the Wabanaki Confederacy and fought with the French. The Wabanaki Confederacy executed raids in the province of Massachusetts Bay and raided Groton in 1707, where several of our ancestors were killed or kidnapped. Kidnapped children could be held ransom or adopted by the tribes of individual Mohawk families. Captured individuals were often adopted into families to take the place of deceased relatives who had died in the war. Captured children played an important role in many Native American tribes, as we will see below. Although many Native tribes treated their English captives well, Massachusetts Puritans claimed to refer death to capture. Not only did they envision a gruesome death at the hands of people they regarded as savages, but even worse fate might befall them if they ended up in one of the Abenaki villages where Jesuit missionaries lived. The possibility of English men and women might be instructed in Catholicism filled them with dread. As I discussed above, Lydia Longley had converted to Catholicism and became a French nun. When the Queen Anne War ended in 1613, Groton had 18 garrison houses in which 58 families could find refuge. For more than 25 years, a peace followed the King George War, before the King George War broke out, and the 7-year war known as America's final French Indian War in the 1750s. Well, this map shows North America in 1702 at the beginning of the Queen Anne War. English colonies are in red, the French settlements are in blue, and the Spanish territories in orange. The disputed areas between England and France in Prince Rupert's Land and Newfoundland, and now what is Maine, are striped in red and blue. The areas disputed between England and Spain in what now is Georgia are striped in red and orange. The rest of the country was controlled by Native Americans. The Queen Anne War was fought on 4 fronts. In the south, Spanish Florida and the English provinces of Carolinas attacked one another, and the English colonists engaged the French bases in Mobile and Biloxi, which were French possessions at the time, with allied Indians on both sides. The Southern War did not result in a significant territorial change, but nearly wiped out the Indian population of Spanish Florida, and parts of what later became Georgia were destroyed, where Spanish missions were destroyed. In New England, English colonists fought against the French colonists and Indian forces in Acadia and Canada. Quebec City was repeatedly targeted by British colonial expeditions, but was never taken, and the Acadian capital of Port Royal and Nova Scotia were captured by the British in 1710. The Tarbell family had the most ancestors affected by the Queen Anne War. The Tarbells come out of second great-grandfather Aaron Corey's branch of the tree through his great-grandmother Anne Tarbell. We have 4 generations of Thomas Tarbells in our tree, starting with 9th great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell, who died in England in 1621. 8th great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell II was born in England and came to Watertown around 1640. Thomas too survived the King Philip War, but died of smallpox in 1678. His son, Thomas Tarbell III, was born in Groton in 1641. Thomas III survived the King Philip War, but was also died of smallpox in 1678. Sixth great-grandfather, Thomas Tarbell IV, was born in Charleston, Massachusetts in 1667. Thomas survived the Indian attacks during the King William War and the Queen Anne War raid in 1707. This tree shows the members of the Tarbell family who were affected by the Queen Anne War. The yellow boxes show our pedigree ancestors, and the green boxes show our non-pedigree ancestors who were killed or kidnapped during the war. Sixth great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell IV was the son of seventh great-grandfather Thomas Tarbell III and wife Hannah Longley. In June 1607, during the Queen Anne War, the French and Abenaki raid captured and kidnapped children of Thomas Tarbell IV and his wife Elizabeth Woods. Raiders took them overland and by water to the Mohawk Mission village of Calaquaki, south of Montreal. Two Tarbell boys, 12-year-old John and 7-year-old Zachariah, were adopted by the Mohawk families and became fully assimilated. The brother's older sister, Sarah Tarbell, was ransomed by the French and was converted to Catholicism. Sarah's second cousin, Lydia Longley, who was kidnapped during the King William War. Note that our fifth great-grandmother, Anne Tarbell, was the only child of the Tarbells not kidnapped during the raid. Sarah Tarbell was born into the Puritan Tarbell family in Groton, Massachusetts in 1693. Lydia's parents were killed during the 1694 raid when she was only 1 year old. In 1607, when she was 14, she was kidnapped by the Mohawk Indians and sold to a prominent French family living in Montreal. Shortly after arrival, she learned that her second cousin, Lydia Longley, that's Sister Magdalene, was there, and she was taken to the Notre Dame convent to meet her. At her own request, she was placed in the Sisters of Notre Dame and became a nun. In 1708, she was baptized into the Catholic faith and given the name Marguerite. She died at the convent and was buried in the chapel of the Infant Jesus in the parish church in Montreal, along with her cousin, Sixta Madeleine. Next, we'll talk about John and Zachariah. John and Zachariah Tarbell were born in Groton, Massachusetts in 1695 and 1700, respectively. In 1707, when John was 12 years old and Zachariah was 7, they were kidnapped by the Mohawk Indians. They were adopted into the Mohawk tribe and given the name Karakawa and Torakoran. They married daughters of Indian chiefs and became Indian chiefs themselves. 30 years later, they visited Groton dressed as Indian chiefs in full war paint. They could not be persuaded to stay and return to their Indian families. The link below can read much more about John and Zachariah's capture and lives with the Indians. However, the story continues. The following are excerpts from a historical sketch of Groton, Massachusetts, 1655 to 1890 by Dr. Samuel Green. The boys remained for many years with their captors in Caughnawaga, in an Indian village on the right banks of the St. Lawrence River. Some years later, the two young men, now chiefs, moved up the St. Lawrence River, accompanied by several others with all their families, and established the village of St. Regis. The Indian settlement was pleasantly situated on the right bank of the St. Lawrence River on the boundary line that separates New York State from Canada. The St. Regis Indians had certain rights to land reservations in the state of New York, and more than once treaties were made with the governor of New York State and the chiefs of the tribe, among of whom were descendants of the Tarbell boys. The treaty was signed on February 20th, 1818 on behalf of Indians by Lauren Tarbell and Thomas Tarbell and two other chiefs. A treaty was signed on September 23rd, 1825 by 11 chiefs and trustees of the tribe, including Peter Tarbell, Thomas Tarbell, Michael Tarbell, Louis Tarbell, and Baptiste Tarbell. A half-breed Indian who usually was known as Peter the Big Speak was the son of one of the Tarbell lads who had been stolen away from Groton by the Indians and who subsequently became one of the first settlers who preceded the founding of St. Regis. He was a man much addressed in ability as a speaker and was selected as a mouthpiece of the tribe in more important contagions when it presented themselves. In the summer of 1877, Samuel Green visited St. Regis, where he met the grandson of one of the Tarbell captives. He was more than 80 years old and spoke no English, and Sam had to talk to him through an interpreter. The following are quotes from Sam Green's book. I learned that he was aware that his grandfather had been taken as a boy from the town near Boston and that he had kinfolk still living there. He was a man of ordinary size with sunburnt face, gray hair, and somewhat balding. There was but little appearance of Indian blood in his veins, and he would have passed anywhere for a good-looking old man. He lived with one of his sons in a small house that was clapboarded and painted and was one of the best houses in the village, where surrounded by his children and grandchildren, he was passing his declining years in comfort and ease. Descendants of John and Zachariah Tarbill still influence the members of the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. This news release comes from the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe 2021. St. Regis Mohawk Tribal Council was saddened to learn about the sudden passing of former tribal chief Philip H. Tarbill, who peacefully passed away at his home on December 16, 2021. Commonly known as Phil, he was elected as tribal sub-chief in 1993 before serving as tribal chief from 1994 to 1997. He initially served under the constitutional government before being elected under the three-chief system to the St. Regis Mohawk tribe. During his time as tribal chief, Phil was passionate about strengthening the governance process of the tribal government, having worked in consultation with tribe membership on the development and the enactment of the Tribal Council Procedures Act of 1994, the Tribal Law Development, Interpretation, and Codification Procedure Act of 1994, and the Judiciary Act of 1994. While on the Tribal Council, he joined efforts to diversify the economy through the Indian gaming and generated much-needed tribal revenue to help support the community's programs and services. He continued to be a formation of the Tribal Gaming Commission and helped to make improvements to the tribal state gaming compound through the tribal referendum process. The yellow boxes indicate pedigree ancestors, and the green boxes are non-pedigree ancestors. Eighth great-grandparents Richard Blood and Elizabeth Wilkins had 3 generations of descendants killed in Indian raids during the King William and the King Philip War. Seventh great-granduncle James Blood married Elizabeth Longley, daughter of eighth great-grandparents William Longley and Joan Goff. James was killed in Groton in the First French Indian War in 1692, but his brother, seventh great-grandfather Nathaniel Blood, and seventh great-grandmother Hannah Parker, daughter of eighth great-grandfather James Parker, survived the attack, along with their daughters, sixth great-grandmother Mary Blood and sixth great-grandaunt Elizabeth Blood. James Blood was the son-in-law John Shattuck, husband of sixth great-aunt Mary Blood, was killed in Groton during the 1609 during the Second French Indian War. John Sr.'s son, John Shattuck Jr., was killed in the same raid. This series of trees has shown the multiple intermarriages between the Parkers, the Bloods, and the Crisps, and the Longleys and the Tarbells, and the effect of the Indian attacks on their families. This table shows our ancestors who were victims of the King William and the Queen Philip's War. 12 were killed, 8 were kidnapped, 1 was scalped but survived, none were pedigree ancestors. All our pedigree ancestors lived in Groton along with their victims, but fortunately survived. The European War of Spanish Succession and the American Queen Anne War ended when England, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic signed Treaty of Utrecht, which was a series of individual peace treaties between the various European countries in between the years of 1713 and 1715. The treaty made Philip V, grandson of Louis XVI of France, the King of Spain. It also forced France to give England some of its land in North America and the Caribbean, including Newfoundland, Acadia, Prince Rupert's Land around the Hudson Bay region, and of northern eastern Canada, as seen in the purple on the map. Further, England was rewarded with a contract which gave them exclusive rights to supply Spanish-American colonies with black slaves at the rate of $4,800 a year for 30 years. Despite the treaty, the fighting between the French, the English, and the Native Americans continued in North America for a number of years after the treaty was signed. Even after the fighting stopped, resentment between the British, the French continued until King George War broke out once again in 1744. The time between 1676 and 1714 was a turbulent time in New England. All the ancestors I talked about in this chapter lived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so I focused exclusively on it. The succession of 4 kings and queens ruled England and British American colonies, each making new rules for the colonies. King Charles II revoked the Massachusetts Bay 1629 charter, which had given the Puritans almost total control of the colony. King James, unable to control the independent and rebellious nature of the New England colonies, combined all of the colonies in the dominion of New England to be ruled by a royal governor appointed by him. The citizens of Boston rebelled, arrested the governor, and illegally restarted the 1621 chapter. King William disbanded the Dominion of New England and issued a new royal charter creating the province of Massachusetts, breaking the stranglehold that the Puritans had on governing the colony by allowing non-Puritans voting rights. The Salem Witch Trials began in 1692 in the midst of all this turmoil. Salem Witch Trial had a major effect on 16 of our ancestors. Although 2 of our pedigree ancestors were convicted, neither was executed. After surviving the King Philip War in 1676, the towns where most of our ancestors lived were attacked again in 1694 and 1707, killing or kidnapping 21 of our ancestors. Again, none of our pedigree ancestors were harmed. This was very fortunate for us, considering that we would not be here if any of our pedigree ancestors were killed before they produced the next generation of pedigree ancestors.